After losing my husband, I raised twins alone. My parents refused to help, but my in-laws opened their home to us. Years later, I sold my horse ranch for $88 million. When my parents appeared, I revealed the gift for my in-laws and their faces froze in shock. My name is Abigail, 34 years old, and until that freezing afternoon at the cemetery, I still believed that blood meant something. I never imagined that the people who brought me into this world would leave me and my infant children to freeze in the rain. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member who showed their true colors when you were at your lowest. The icy rain in Lexington, Kentucky felt like tiny shards of glass against my face. The wind howled through the barren branches of the old oak trees, carrying a bitter chill that seeped through my thin wool coat. I stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, my boots sinking into the wet mud. My arms ached from the weight of my 6-month-old twins, Leo and Lily, whom I held tightly against my chest. They were crying, their small bodies shivering despite the thick blankets I had wrapped them in. They were hungry, they were cold, and they were fatherless. Below us lay the polished wooden casket of my husband Liam. He was gone. Just like that, the brightest light in my life had been extinguished. A sudden aggressive illness had taken him from us in a matter of 8 grueling months, leaving me a widow at 34. Liam was the kindest man I had ever known. He was an artist, a man who saw beauty in the mundane and captured the soul of the world on his canvases. He painted with a passion that made you believe in magic. But passion does not pay for experimental medical treatments. When the doctors gave us the diagnosis, our world stopped. The insurance company denied the out-of-network specialists, calling the life-saving procedures experimental. We fought them, but time was a luxury Liam did not have. The medical bills became a relentless, suffocating avalanche. I sold everything of value. I liquidated my modest retirement fund. We sold our beautiful small home and moved into a cramped rental just to keep up with the pharmacy copays and hospital stays. I swallowed my pride and maxed out every credit card to my name. In the end, it was not enough to save him. The illness took his strength, his voice, and finally his life. The financial devastation was absolute. The bank officially finalized the foreclosure on our last remaining assets the day before the funeral. Every single penny went to the hospital collections department. I had absolutely nothing left but the 2 fragile lives crying in my arms and the overwhelming, crushing grief that threatened to pull me into the ground alongside the man I loved. My family had always hated Liam. My parents, Howard and Beverly, measured a person's worth entirely by their investment portfolio and their zip code. Growing up in a massive 5-bedroom estate, in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods, I was taught that image was everything. To my parents, Liam's art degree was a punchline. It was a running joke at their lavish Thanksgiving dinners. They never saw his kindness, his devotion, or his brilliant mind. They only saw a man who did not work on Wall Street, a man who did not drive a luxury car, a man who did not fit into their perfectly curated country club aesthetic. I turned my eyes away from the grave and looked at my parents. They stood a few yards away, perfectly dry beneath a massive custom-made golf umbrella held by my father. My mother was dressed in a pristine black designer coat. Her makeup was flawless, completely untouched by the downpour. She looked more like she was attending a high society gala than her son-in-law's funeral. My father wore a tailored Italian suit, openly checking his phone with obvious impatience, annoyed that the burial was taking time away from his business day. Next to them stood my younger sister, Brittany. She was 29 and the undisputed golden child of the family. She had married a wealthy real estate developer named Derek, fulfilling every expectation my parents ever had. She never made a mistake in their eyes, mostly because they bankrolled her entire existence and covered up her constant failures. Brittany was standing there scrolling through her social media feed, occasionally sighing loudly, completely oblivious to the tragedy unfolding just feet away. I took a shaky breath. The cold air burned my lungs. I had no money for rent, no money for formula, and nowhere to sleep that night. I knew I had to ask them for help. It was the hardest thing I have ever had to do, begging the people who had always belittled my choices. But I was not asking for me. I was asking for Leo and Lily. I walked toward them, my boots making squelching sounds in the mud. Leo let out a sharp, pitiful cry. I rocked him gently, trying to provide a warmth I simply did not possess. I stopped in front of my parents. They did not reach out to hold their grandchildren. They did not offer me shelter under their massive umbrella. They just stared at me, waiting for me to speak. Mom, Dad. I started, my voice trembling from the cold and the exhaustion. The bank took the last of the money yesterday. Everything went to Liam's hospital bills. We have absolutely nowhere to go tonight. We have no house. We have no money. I swallowed hard, hating the raw desperation echoing in my own voice. I just need a place to stay, just for a month, just until I can find a job and get back on my feet. Your house has 5 bedrooms. Please let us use one. I will sleep on the floor. Just let the babies be safe from the cold. My mother Beverly did not even flinch. Her expression remained completely devoid of maternal warmth. She slowly lowered her gaze and looked at me as if I had just asked her to harbor a criminal. She elegantly adjusted her designer veil, ensuring not a single drop of rain touched her perfectly styled blonde hair. Your sister Brittany needs the guest wing for her new Pilates studio. Abigail, she said, her tone as casual as if she were discussing dinner reservations. We cannot have 2 screaming infants ruining her peace. She is under a lot of stress right now with her home renovations. She needs that space to center herself. I stared at her, my mind unable to process the sheer absurdity of the words. A Pilates studio. My husband was being buried in the freezing ground right in front of us. My children were shivering in the rain. And my mother was denying us shelter because my sister needed a room to do yoga. A Pilates studio. I repeated, my voice cracking. Mom, Liam is dead. I have no money. I have no food for the babies tonight. I am begging you. They are your grandchildren. Beverly sighed, a sharp, irritated sound that cut deeper than the winter wind. You chose a man with a useless art degree instead of a proper portfolio, Abigail. We warned you this would happen. You threw your life away for a romantic fantasy, and now you have to face the consequences. This is what happens when you refuse to listen to us. You made your bed with that starving artist, and now you have to lie in it. Before I could even respond to the sheer cruelty of her statement, Brittany stepped forward. She pulled her expensive cashmere scarf tighter around her neck and glared at my crying children with open disgust. Seriously, Abigail, can you make them stop wailing? Brittany complained loudly, her voice echoing through the solemn silence of the cemetery. This is supposed to be a respectable funeral, and they are completely ruining the somber aesthetic. I am trying to take a respectful photo for my followers to show I am grieving, and your kids are making it impossible to get a good shot. You are being so inconsiderate right now. I felt a sickness rise in my stomach. She was complaining about the aesthetic of a funeral. My children were freezing, and she was worried about her social media followers. I looked from my sister's annoyed face to my mother's cold stare, and finally to my father. Surely Howard would step in. Surely the man who had raised me would not let his daughter and his infant grandchildren sleep on the freezing streets in the dead of winter. He had millions in the bank. A hotel room would be pocket change to him. My father finally put his phone away. He looked at me with an expression of mild annoyance, the same look he gave a business deal that was not going his way. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his leather checkbook. He quickly scribbled something down, tore the check out, and held it out to me. Be realistic, Abigail, Howard said, his voice completely devoid of warmth, empathy, or parental love. You made your bed. Take this and find a cheap roadside motel for the week. Figure it out like an adult. We are not running a charity. He shoved the crumpled paper toward me. I reached out with a trembling hand and took it. I looked down at the slip of paper. It was a check for $500. $500 to replace a lifetime of parental support. $500 to fix the fact that my entire world had just ended. It was not a lifeline. It was a dismissal. It was a payoff to make me go away and stop being an embarrassment to their perfect, wealthy image. Without another word, my father turned his back on me. He grabbed my mother's arm and ushered Brittany toward their waiting luxury SUV. The driver opened the doors and they climbed inside, leaving the cold reality of the cemetery behind them. I stood completely alone in the freezing rain, holding my sobbing babies against my chest, watching the red taillights of my family's car disappear into the gray mist. The people who were supposed to protect me had walked away without looking back. That was the exact moment I realized I had no family left. At least no blood family. But I was about to learn that true family is not defined by blood at all. The red tail lights of my parents' luxury SUV blurred through the freezing Kentucky rain, disappearing down the cemetery road until they were swallowed completely by the gray mist. I stood rooted to the muddy ground beside my husband's freshly dug grave. In my trembling hand, the crumpled check for $500 felt like a physical burn against my skin. $500. That was the exact value my father placed on my survival and the survival of his own grandchildren. My mother's words echoed in my ears, sharp and precise. Your sister Brittany needs the guest wing for her new Pilates studio. We cannot have two screaming infants ruining her peace. The wind ripped across the open graveyard, driving the icy rain sideways. Leo let out a sharp, breathless wail, his tiny face turning red from the cold. I adjusted my grip, pulling him and his twin sister Lily tighter against my chest beneath my soaked wool coat, but I had no warmth left to give them. I stared down at the check. My father had told me to be realistic and find a cheap motel, casually discarding us as an embarrassing inconvenience. They were going back to their massive estate to comfort my sister over the traumatic aesthetic disruption of a funeral, leaving me with nothing but medical debt, two starving infants, and a piece of paper that would not even cover a month of formula and diapers. A heavy footstep in the mud broke through my shock. I turned to see David and Karen Liam parents stepping out from the shadow of a large weeping willow near the cemetery gates. They had stood silently during my parents' brutal dismissal, giving us privacy, but now they moved forward with a quiet, undeniable purpose. The past 8 months had aged them both a decade. David, a man who had worked his entire life in construction, looked hollowed out, his broad shoulders stooped beneath the weight of losing his only son. Karen's face was pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. I knew exactly what they had sacrificed. When Liam experimental treatments were denied by insurance, my wealthy parents had refused to contribute a single dime, claiming it was a bad investment. David and Karen, on the other hand, had liquidated everything. They drained their retirement accounts, sold their modest home, and took on crushing debt just to buy Liam a few more months of life. They were practically bankrupt, living in a rented apartment on the edge of town, entirely stripped of the comfortable future they had worked 40 years to build. Yet as David approached, there was no hesitation in his eyes. Without saying a word, he unbuttoned his heavy fleece-lined jacket. He stripped it off, standing in the freezing downpour in nothing but a thin suit shirt, and draped the massive coat over my shoulders, tucking the thick material carefully around Leo and Lily. The instant barrier against the wind made the twins quiet down their small bodies, instinctively burrowing into the residual warmth of their grandfather. I am so sorry, Abigail, David said, his voice thick with unshed tears. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the collar around the babies. If we had the cash, we would put you up in the best place in town. We would buy you a house today. But the hospital bills took it all. We have nothing left in the bank. You gave Liam a fighting chance, I whispered, my voice breaking. You gave everything. You do not owe me an apology. Karen stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me, holding me and the twins in a fierce, protective embrace. My mother had not touched me once today. My mother had actively stepped away to protect her designer coat from the mud. Karen held me like I was her own flesh and blood. We do not have money. David continued, his jaw tightening with determination. But I do have the old property out in Bourbon County, the 200-acre farm my father left me. I know Liam told you about it. The soil is hard, the pastures are overgrown, and the main barn is falling apart. It has not been a working farm in 20 years. But the taxes are paid, the well pumps clean water, and the roof on the farmhouse does not leak. He looked me directly in the eyes. It is not much, but it is paid off. It is yours, Abigail. The land, the house, the barns, everything. I stared at him, stunned. David, I cannot take your family land. It is the only asset you have left. You need to sell it to recover your retirement. That land belongs to Liam children, Karen said firmly, stepping back and wiping the rain from my cheek. "We already signed the deed transfer this morning. It is in your name. We will not let our grandchildren sleep in a motel, and we certainly will not let Howard and Beverly dictate your future. You take that farm, Abigail. You take it and you build whatever you need to survive." I looked down at the $500 check still crumpled in my fist. My blood family had looked at my desperation and seen a liability. My in-laws had looked at their own bankruptcy and still found a way to give me an empire. I shoved my father's check into my pocket, the paper tearing slightly. "I accept," I told them, my voice suddenly losing its tremor. "I will make it mean something. I promise you both I will make this mean something." We stood together over Liam's grave for a few more minutes, a united front against the bitter cold before David and Karen had to leave for their jobs. They were working night shifts now, pushing past exhaustion to pay off the remaining medical debt. I walked back to the cemetery parking lot and climbed into Liam's old rusted pickup truck, the only vehicle we had not sold. The heater barely worked, rattling loudly as it blew lukewarm air into the cab. I carefully strapped Leo and Lily into their car seats, wrapping David's thick coat over their legs. I put the truck in gear and drove out of the cemetery, leaving the manicured lawns and wealthy estates of Lexington behind me. I drove for an hour, the city giving way to winding country roads, rolling hills, and vast stretches of empty land. The rain began to let up, leaving behind a heavy gray fog that clung to the damp earth. When I finally turned onto the dirt driveway of the property, the reality of David's words set in. The 200-acre farm was completely, wildly overgrown. The wooden fences were splintered and rotting. The massive main barn leaned slightly to the left, its faded red paint peeling in long, jagged strips. The farmhouse itself was small, weathered, and surrounded by knee-high weeds. To my parents, this place would be a nightmare. To my sister Brittany, it would be a punchline, a filthy, unsalvageable dumping ground. But as I parked the rusted truck in front of the sagging porch, I did not see decay. I saw acres of pristine, untethered potential. I saw space where my children could walk without ever having to ask my parents for permission. I saw a fortress where Howard and Beverly conditional love could never reach us. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence of the countryside was deafening, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of my twins in the back seat. I adjusted the rearview mirror, angling it so I could see Leo and Lily. Their faces were relaxed, finally warm beneath their grandfather coat. Then I tilted the mirror up to look at my own reflection. My hair was plastered to my skull from the rain. My eyes were dark, shadowed by months of grief, exhaustion, and terror. But the frightened, desperate woman who had begged her mother for shelter just 2 hours ago was gone. In her place was a cold, impenetrable resolve. I wiped the remaining rain and tears from my face with the back of my hand. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crumpled $500 check from my father, and tore it cleanly in half. I dropped the pieces onto the floorboard. "I will build an empire from this dirt," I whispered to the quiet cab of the truck, the words etching themselves into my soul like stone. "I will turn this broken ground into power, and my blood family will never ever touch a single cent of it." The thoroughbred shifted its massive weight, but Abigail ran her hands firmly down its left foreleg, soothing the anxious animal. The hydrotherapy treadmill hummed around them, churning purified, chilled water against the horse tendons. Abigail checked the tablet in her hand, studying the real-time ultrasound imaging displayed on the screen. The micro tears in the suspensory ligament were nearly completely fused. She pressed the comms button on her earpiece, speaking over the sound of the rushing water. "Marcus, the regenerative stem cell therapy was a complete success. You can tell the prince his champion will be fully cleared for the Dubai World Cup next month. Send the final invoice to his estate manager." 6 years had passed since the day I drove a rusted pickup truck onto a barren, overgrown plot of dirt. The dilapidated barn with the sagging roof was gone. In its place stood the Vanguard Equine Rehabilitation Center, a multi-million-dollar fortress of glass, steel, and pristine white fencing. We did not just breed horses here, we rebuilt them. I had spent every waking hour of the last 6 years studying equine genetics, securing grants, taking out high-risk business loans, and leveraging my background in biological sciences to create the most elite equine therapy facility in North America. Olympic riders, Arabian royalty, and Kentucky Derby winners brought their horses to my gates. I handed the lead rope to my head stable master and stepped out of the hydrotherapy bay. The air smelled of clean pine and expensive leather. As I walked down the immaculate cobblestone path toward the main office, I heard the sound of bright, innocent laughter. 6-year-old Leo and Lily sprinted across the perfectly manicured lawn chasing a golden retriever puppy. They were healthy, vibrant, and deeply loved. Behind them, David drove a brand new John Deere tractor toward the storage silos, while Karen waved at me from the porch of their custom-built farmhouse. I had built them a home right on the property. We had survived the storm together, and we had conquered it. I pushed open the heavy glass doors of my office and was immediately greeted by my assistant Sarah. She handed me a stack of daily reports and a steaming cup of coffee. The invoices for the hyperbaric chamber maintenance have been paid, and the Japanese syndicate wired the down payment for the new breeding contract, Sarah said, matching my fast pace as I walked to my desk. But we also received a strange piece of mail redirected from your old P.O. box. I left it on your keyboard. I picked up the thick cream-colored envelope. The return address bore the crest of my parents' exclusive country club in Boston. I ripped it open. It was a mass-printed newsletter highlighting the charitable donations of the club elite members. There, circled in red pen, was a section detailing a modest donation made by Howard and Beverly to a homeless shelter. In the margins, someone had written a handwritten note, probably from my sister Brittany. The note read, "Just thought you should know. Mom and Dad are still cleaning up messes for people who cannot help themselves. Let us know if you need a canned food drive sent to your dirt patch." I stared at the note, feeling a cold, hard smile form on my face. 6 years and they still thought I was rotting in poverty. They had never once driven out to check on me or their grandchildren. They had simply written me off as a failure, completely blind to the empire I was quietly building right under their noses. I dropped the newsletter into the paper shredder and turned my attention back to the massive screens displaying our global stock and equity portfolios. Let them think I am starving, I thought to myself. The element of surprise is a weapon you only get to use once. Sarah knocked on the open door frame. "Abigail, the representatives from Vanguard Development are here. They are early. Send them in," I said, adjusting my tailored blazer. 3 men in sharply cut custom suits walked into my office. They looked entirely out of place, surrounded by the rolling green pastures and equestrian equipment. The man leading the group introduced himself as Richard Sterling, the lead acquisitions director for a global luxury real estate conglomerate. He offered a firm handshake, taking a quick calculating glance around my office. His eyes lingered on the expensive modern art and the high-tech monitoring equipment. He had clearly expected to walk into a rustic farm office smelling of manure and hay. "Miss Wilson," Sterling said, taking a seat across from my desk, "I will get straight to the point. My firm is developing an ultra-exclusive mega resort. We are talking about 2 championship golf courses, a private airstrip, 5-star culinary experiences, and luxury private villas. We have already quietly acquired 5,000 acres of the surrounding farmland. We are ready to break ground." I leaned back in my chair, steepling my fingers. "And what does that have to do with my equine facility, Mr. Sterling?" "Your 200 acres sit directly in the center of our development map," Sterling explained, pulling a glossy presentation folder from his leather briefcase. "Because of the natural elevation and the deep water springs on your land, we need this specific acreage to serve as the crown jewel of the resort. We want to build the main clubhouse and the luxury polo grounds exactly where your barns are currently sitting. Your land is the keystone property, Miss Wilson. We cannot finalize the master plan without it." I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window of my office. I had poured my blood, sweat, and tears into this soil. It was the place that saved me and my children. But I was not a sentimental fool. I was a businesswoman, and every square inch of dirt had a price. "I have active contracts, Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "I have 20 Olympic-caliber horses currently undergoing rehabilitation. I have a staff of 50 people, and I have a family living on this land. Moving this operation would require a massive logistical undertaking, and quite frankly, I am highly profitable right where I am. You are going to have to make this worth my time." Sterling did not blink. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He recognized that I was not a desperate farmer looking for a quick payout. He opened the folder and pulled out a thick legal contract bound in heavy blue cardstock. "We understand the value of your operation," Miss Wilson Sterling said, sliding the contract smoothly across the polished wood of my desk. "We also understand that your expertise is what makes this facility elite, not the physical location. You can rebuild this institute anywhere in the world. We are prepared to ensure that you have the resources to do exactly that." I looked down at the contract. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, searching for the purchase price. When I found the bolded numbers at the bottom of the second page, my heart stopped beating for a fraction of a second. I kept my face entirely impassive, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing my shock. The developer was offering a staggering $88 million for the 200 acres and the physical facilities. $88 million. It was an astronomical sum. It was generational wealth. It was the kind of money that bought entire islands, that shifted the trajectory of a family bloodline forever. It was enough to build 3 new facilities twice the size of this one, and still never have to look at a bank statement for the rest of my life. I slowly closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it. "I will need my legal team to review every clause of this agreement, Mr. Sterling. I want total confidentiality regarding this sale until the closing date. No press releases, no public announcements, absolutely no leaks to the local real estate boards." Sterling smiled, recognizing that he had just secured his keystone property. "We require the exact same discretion, Miss Wilson. We will schedule the final signing and escrow transfer for next Saturday evening." As Sterling and his men shook my hand and exited the office, the sheer magnitude of the moment washed over me. I stood up and walked to the window, watching their black Maybach disappear down the gravel driveway. $88 million. I had literally turned dirt into gold. I thought about the torn $500 check my father had thrown at me. I thought about my mother complaining about her Pilates studio while I stood freezing at my husband's grave. Suddenly, the harsh ring of my private cell phone broke the silence in the room. I glanced at the caller ID. It was a Boston area code. It was my mother, Beverly. It was the very first time she had called my number in 6 years. I stared at the flashing screen, a cold sense of anticipation coiling in my chest. Let the games begin. I picked up the phone on the 4th ring. I did not say hello. I simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for the voice that had haunted my nightmares for the better part of a decade. "Abigail," my mother barked, her voice sharp, hurried, and entirely devoid of warmth. There was no hesitation, no soft inquiry about my well-being, no questions about the twins she had abandoned in a freezing cemetery 6 years ago. It was as if we had spoken just yesterday, and I was still the disappointing daughter who owed her unquestioning obedience. "We have a situation here in Boston, and I need you to listen to me very carefully." I leaned back in my leather executive chair. The massive blue cardstock contract from Vanguard Development sat heavy and pristine on my desk. I rested my hand on it, feeling the thick, expensive paper beneath my fingertips. "What kind of situation, Beverly? Do not use that tone with me," she snapped immediately, falling right back into her old patterns of absolute authority. "It is your sister. Brittany is an absolute wreck. You know her 10-year wedding anniversary is coming up next month. She has been planning a massive vow renewal ceremony for the better part of a year. 200 guests. The mayor is coming. Half the board of the country club is attending. It is the social event of the season, and everything is falling apart because Derek has been a complete fool." I remained completely silent, letting her frantic energy fill the space. I knew Derek. I knew his arrogance. I knew he played fast and loose with other people's money. He leveraged their liquid assets into a commercial real estate venture that completely tanked my mother, continued, her breath hitching with a rare display of genuine panic. "He lost millions, Abigail. Millions. They are practically house poor right now. They cannot afford the deposit at the Waldorf. They cannot afford the country club ballroom. If word gets out that Derek is over-leveraged, his remaining investors will pull their backing. They will be ruined. We will be ruined. The social humiliation would be absolute. We cannot let those vicious gossips at the club know that Brittany is struggling." I traced the edge of the $88 million contract with my index finger. And how exactly does Brittany's financial ruin involve me? Beverly let out a sharp, exasperated sigh, clearly annoyed that I was not immediately offering my subservience. We have to pivot the aesthetic of the vow renewal. Brittany found this article in a high-fashion magazine about rustic chic luxury events. Wealthy people pretending to be down to earth by hosting black tie events in barns. It is very trendy right now. If we move the venue to a farm, it looks like a deliberate stylish choice rather than a desperate downgrade. It is the perfect cover story. We will tell everyone Brittany wanted something grounded and authentic for her 10-year milestone. I see, I said softly, the picture coming into perfect agonizing focus. You want to use my property. You want to use the farm David and Karen gave me. It is the only logical solution. Beverly declared, her tone shifting from panicked to demanding. You owe us this, Abigail. We raised you. We put you through school. We gave you everything before you threw it all away on that foolish marriage. This is your chance to finally be useful to this family. We are moving the entire event to Kentucky. We are telling the guests it is a destination renewal at a quaint family property. She did not wait for my response. She just kept bulldozing forward, laying out her demands as if my farm were a public park she had already rented. We will handle the catering and the floral arrangements, but you need to clean up your mess, Beverly commanded. I know that old property is a falling apart mud patch. You need to clear out whatever rusty tractors and junk you have lying around. We need the main barn completely emptied. Scrub the floors. Get rid of the smell. If you have farm animals, lock them away somewhere far from the main house. I cannot have Brittany's guests stepping in manure in their designer shoes. We need a clean rustic backdrop, nothing more. I stood up and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. Outside, my staff of highly trained equine specialists was leading a string of million-dollar Arabian thoroughbreds into the hyperbaric healing chambers. The pristine white fences gleamed in the afternoon sun. The roads were paved in imported cobblestone. The facility looked like a modern tech campus, not a mud patch. My mother had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. She still pictured the rotting wood and the rusted pickup truck. She still pictured me as a desperate broken widow begging for scraps. You want to bring 200 high society guests to my farm, I clarified, keeping my voice entirely devoid of the dark rising amusement bubbling in my chest. You want to host a luxury event on my property. Yes, Beverly snapped. And we are not paying you a venue fee. This is a family favor. You should be honored that Brittany is willing to lower her standards to use your cute little petting zoo. It will probably be the nicest thing that has ever happened on that dirt patch. Now we are coming up a week early to set up and oversee the transformation. We will need the main house. You and the twins can sleep in the loft above the barn, or wherever you usually stay. Brittany needs the master suite for her hair and makeup team. Derek needs an office space to handle his remaining business calls. You will stay out of the way. I do not want you embarrassing us by trying to mingle with the guests. You can handle the parking logistics and direct traffic at the main gate. She was attempting to turn me into the hired help on my own land. She was attempting to evict me from my own home to accommodate a sister who had complained about my grieving children ruining a funeral aesthetic. It was breathtaking. The absolute audacity was a marvel to witness. When is the event? I asked, my voice steady, cold, and precise. Next Saturday, Beverly replied, her tone impatient. The guests are arriving at 6 in the evening. The vow renewal ceremony will happen right at sunset, exactly at 7 o'clock. It is going to be perfect. So you need to start clearing out of that barn today. Do you understand me, Abigail? I do not want any excuses. I walked back to my desk. I looked down at the heavy blue cardstock folder. The contract from Vanguard Development. I flipped to the third page where the closing timeline was detailed. Richard Sterling, the luxury developer, had set the final signing and the irreversible wire transfer of the $88 million for next Saturday, exactly at 7 o'clock in the evening. The collision of these two events was so perfectly poetic that it almost felt orchestrated by a higher power. At the exact moment my toxic image-obsessed family planned to parade their fake wealth and use my property to hide their spectacular financial ruin, the absolute undeniable truth of my empire would be legally cemented in front of every single one of their high society friends. They wanted to use my land as a stage for their lies. I was going to use it as an execution block for their egos. Abigail, my mother barked through the phone receiver. Are you listening to me? I said we need the venue cleared by Monday. I picked up my customized gold pen and tapped it gently against the $88 million figure printed on the contract. I felt the last lingering threads of childhood trauma, the fear of my mother's disapproval, and the pain of their abandonment, completely evaporate. They were nothing to me now. They were just ghosts walking blindly into a trap they had built themselves. Abigail looks down at the $88 million contract. A sharp smile touches her lips. Of course, Mom, Abigail says smoothly. I'd love to host the family. The black Lincoln Navigator rolled through the main gates of Vanguard Equine Rehabilitation Center precisely at 9 o'clock on Monday morning. The heavy tires crunched loudly over the imported cobblestone driveway, kicking up a fine mist of morning dew. I stood on the wraparound porch of my office, a steaming mug of black coffee in my hand, watching the luxury SUV come to a halt near the central courtyard. They were a full week early for the vow renewal, just as Beverly had threatened. I watched as the doors swung open, and my family stepped out onto the pristine walkways, bringing the suffocating weight of my past directly into the bright, clean air of my present. My mother, Beverly, stepped out first. She immediately pulled a silk scarf over her nose and mouth, her face contorting into a mask of pure disgust. She wore a tailored cream pantsuit that was entirely inappropriate for a working facility, her eyes darting around the immaculate grounds, as if searching for a disease. My father, Howard, emerged from the driver's side, slamming the door with unnecessary force. He puffed out his chest, adjusting his designer tie, surveying the landscape with the arrogant, dismissive glare of a man who believed everything he looked at was beneath him. Then came Brittany. She slid out of the back seat wearing white stiletto heels, an oversized sun hat, and a look of absolute horror. She shrieked loudly, teetering on the cobblestone as she examined the bottom of her shoe for imaginary mud. Behind her, shuffling out of the vehicle like a man walking to the gallows, was Derek. Brittany's husband looked terrible. His complexion was an unhealthy, chalky gray. Sweat beaded at his hairline despite the crisp morning chill. He nervously clutched a leather briefcase to his chest, his eyes darting frantically. He carried the distinct, suffocating aura of a man secretly drowning in millions of dollars of debt, desperate to keep the charade alive for just one more week. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter taste, and walked down the porch steps to greet them. Good Lord, Abigail Beverly complained loudly before I was even within 10 feet of them. The stench of livestock is simply unbearable. We had to roll the windows up 2 miles down the road. How do you live in this filth? I looked around at the perfectly manicured lawns, the state-of-the-art ventilation systems, and the rows of pristine white fencing. The air smelled faintly of fresh pine needles and expensive leather saddles. There was no filth anywhere to be found, but my mother was determined to see a slum. It is a working equine facility, Mom, I said smoothly, keeping my voice perfectly even. Welcome to Kentucky. Brittany pushed past our mother, waving a manicured hand frantically in the air, as if trying to swat away invisible flies. Abigail, this is a disaster! Brittany whined, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet courtyard. This place is entirely too rustic. I told the wedding planner we wanted chic country vintage, not actual dirt and animals. You need to call your little farmhands right now and have them start scrubbing everything. She pointed a sharp, accusing finger toward the primary rehabilitation wing. It was a massive 50,000 square foot structure made of reinforced steel and climate-controlled glass housing millions of dollars in advanced medical technology. That smelly barn right there needs to be completely gutted by Wednesday morning, Brittany demanded, walking awkwardly toward the facility in her stilettos. I am bringing in a team of decorators from New York. We are going to drape the entire interior in white chiffon and string up crystal chandeliers to hide the hideous rafters. Tell your workers to get all these animals out of sight immediately. I cannot have my high net worth friends drinking vintage champagne while a bunch of muddy farm animals are staring at them. It is disgusting. I stepped into her path, cutting off her march toward the rehabilitation wing. My stance was relaxed, but my eyes were locked directly onto hers. Those animals, I said, my tone dropping to a dangerous quiet register, are elite Olympic athletes and champion thoroughbreds, undergoing highly sensitive medical protocols. Some of the horses in that wing are worth more than your entire neighborhood in Boston. They are not moving for white chiffon Brittany. Brittany rolled her eyes, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh of exasperation. Oh, please. They are horses, Abigail. Stop being so dramatic and pretending you run some sort of prestigious operation. Just tie them to a tree in the back field or whatever you people do out here. I am the bride, and this weekend is about me. Derek has investors coming from Dubai, and we need this venue to look like $1 million, not a charity project. Derek flinched visibly at the mention of his investors, shifting his weight nervously from foot to foot. He refused to make eye contact with me, staring resolutely at the cobblestone beneath his expensive loafers. We will deal with the livestock logistics later, Beverly interrupted, stepping between me and Brittany. She waved her hand dismissively, officially ending the conversation in her own mind. Right now, we need to get the living arrangements sorted. Brittany is absolutely exhausted from the flight, and her makeup and hair team will be arriving from Manhattan on Thursday. We need to set up the bridal suite immediately. Beverly did not wait for my permission. She simply turned on her heel and began marching briskly toward the main residence. The house I shared with my twins was a beautifully restored two-story farmhouse, updated with modern amenities, but retaining its original charm. It was my sanctuary. The place where Leo and Lily had taken their first steps, where they slept soundly every night, entirely safe from the toxic judgment of the people currently invading our space. I followed my mother up the front porch steps, my heart rate remaining perfectly steady. I was not the terrified broken widow from the cemetery anymore. I was the master of this domain, and I was going to let them dig their own graves. Beverly pushed open the front door and walked into the grand foyer. She completely ignored the warm, inviting decor, the family photos lining the walls, and the crackling fireplace. She immediately began opening doors, conducting a ruthless inspection of my home. Howard, Brittany, and Derek filed in behind her, treating my house like a hotel lobby they had already deemed subpar. Beverly threw open the door to the primary guest room, which served as Leo and Lily's bedroom. It was a large, sunlit space filled with colorful books, an overflowing toy chest, and two small beds covered in brightly patterned quilts. The room was vibrant, joyful, and distinctly belonged to two happy 6-year-old children. Beverly stopped in the doorway, her nose wrinkling in distaste. She turned sharply toward Derek, who was still clutching his briefcase. Derek, go out to the garage and find a large black garbage bag, Beverly commanded, pointing a rigid finger at the children's beds. Pack all of this plastic junk up right now. Strip the beds, clear out the closets, put the kids in the loft above the barn or wherever the farmhands sleep. Brittany needs this master suite for her makeup team. The natural lighting in here is the only acceptable light in this dreary house. Derek, you can take the adjoining room to handle your remaining business calls. Abigail, you and the twins need to be out of this house by noon. We require total privacy to focus on the event. Derek nodded meekly, setting his briefcase down on a hallway table. He took a step toward my children's room, raising his hands, as if preparing to rip the quilts directly off the beds. I stepped smoothly into the doorframe, placing my body entirely blocking the entrance. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I simply radiated a cold, absolute authority that froze Derek dead in his tracks. Put your hands in your pockets, Derek, I said softly. Derek blinked, his pale face flushing with sudden embarrassment. He instinctively pulled his hands back, taking a clumsy step away from the bedroom door. Beverly puffed up her chest, her face turning an angry mottled red. Excuse me, she snapped, her voice echoing sharply against the hardwood floors. We are trying to help you upgrade this miserable place, Abigail. We are bringing high society to your doorstep. The least you can do is get your crying brats out of the way, so your sister can have one perfect weekend. Move aside. I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had denied me shelter when I had absolutely nothing. I felt a profound, beautiful calm wash over my entire body. I did not move a single inch. You touch my children's things and you are off the property, I said, my voice cutting through the air like a steel blade. Every syllable was precise, heavy, and completely devoid of fear. I stared directly into Beverly's eyes, watching the sudden shock register in her pupils. You will not pack up their rooms. You will not displace my children. You are guests here. Act like it. The silence in the hallway was absolute. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no immediate retort. Her mouth opened and closed in stunned silence. She was completely unaccustomed to defiance, especially from the daughter she had always considered weak. Howard suddenly stepped forward from the back of the hallway, his face dark purple with sudden explosive rage. He pointed a thick, aggressive finger inches from my face. "You do not speak to your mother that way!" Howard bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging against his silk collar. "Who do you think you are talking to? After everything we have done for you, after we funded your entire life, you stand there in your little mud patch and disrespect the people who kept you from starving in the streets. You are an ungrateful, pathetic disappointment." He did not wait for my response. Howard spun around on his heel, completely outraged by my pushback, and stormed out the front door, slamming it so hard the windows rattled in their frames. He marched furiously down the porch steps and stomped into the central courtyard, muttering loudly to himself about my lack of respect. I walked calmly to the front window, pulling back the sheer curtain to watch him. Outside, Marcus, my elite head trainer, was leading a majestic jet-black Arabian stallion across the courtyard toward the hydrotherapy wing. Marcus was a highly respected professional, currently employed by a prominent Dubai racing syndicate to oversee the rehabilitation of their prized horse. Howard, desperate to assert his dominance and soothe his bruised ego, marched directly into Marcus's path. Howard threw his shoulders back, practically blocking the million-dollar stallion. "You work for my daughter!" Howard demanded loudly, making sure his booming voice carried across the entire courtyard. Marcus stopped, soothing the startled horse with a gentle hand on its neck. He looked at Howard with mild confusion. "I am the head trainer, yes, sir." Howard let out a loud, arrogant scoff, gesturing wildly toward the massive state-of-the-art rehabilitation facilities surrounding them. "Well, I hope she is paying you well. I am the one who funded this whole operation," Howard proudly proclaimed, his voice dripping with unearned superiority. "I bought this land. I built those barns. I am the reason she survived when she had absolutely nothing. You are looking at the man who owns this entire empire. So you make sure you show my family the proper respect while we are visiting my property." I stood silently at the window, watching my father take complete aggressive credit for the blood and sweat I had poured into the soil over the last 6 years. I watched him claim ownership of an empire he had actively refused to save. I felt the sharp, satisfying smile return to my lips. My father was digging his grave with his own arrogant words, and I was going to gladly push him in. I watched the high-definition security feed on my office monitor with a cold, calculated fascination. The discreet microphones positioned around the central courtyard picked up every single word of my father's tirade with crystal clarity. Howard was practically vibrating with unearned self-importance, jabbing his thick finger at my head trainer chest. Marcus, a man who regularly negotiated with volatile billionaires and managed skittish million-dollar stallions, remained utterly unbothered by the red-faced man shouting at him. "I pulled her out of the gutter," Howard bellowed, his voice echoing through the speakers on my desk. "I bought this land. I built these barns with my own money. If it were not for my generosity, she would be sleeping in a motel. So you will address my family with the utmost respect, because we own everything you see here." Marcus simply nodded, his face a mask of polite professional indifference, and led the Arabian stallion toward the hydrotherapy wing without uttering another word. Howard stood in the center of the cobblestone, breathing heavily, looking immensely satisfied with his own fabricated dominance. He had absolutely no idea his entire performance was being digitally archived on a secure server. I tapped a few keys on my keyboard, clipping the video file and saving it to a designated folder. In the corporate world, leverage was everything. In my family, it was the only currency that mattered. I turned away from the monitor and stepped out of my office to oversee the morning operations. The Kentucky air was crisp and clean, but the tension radiating from my uninvited guests hung thick like summer humidity. Down by the main, Beverly had successfully bullied Derek into moving their designer luggage onto the front porch, treating the property like a personal resort that had somehow lost her reservation. Brittany, meanwhile, had grown bored of complaining about the smell of the stables. I spotted her wandering aimlessly toward the administrative wing, her white stilettos clicking sharply against the stone pathway. She was peering into the windows of the veterinary clinic, her face twisted in a perpetual sneer. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was hunting for weakness. She was looking for rust, for unpaid notices, for anything she could drag back to Boston, as proof that I was still the pathetic sister who needed their charity. I let her roam. I had built a fortress, and there were no cracks in the foundation. My veterinary wing housed hyperbaric oxygen chambers, digital radiography units, and an on-site surgical suite that rivaled top human hospitals. Brittany would find no dirt here. I watched her pass the clinic and head toward the main reception area, a beautifully designed timber and glass structure where high net worth clients waited while we evaluated their champions. Before Brittany could reach the reception doors, the heavy iron security gates at the front of the property buzzed open. A sleek black Mercedes sedan crunched up the driveway, bypassing the visitor lot and pulling directly up to the administrative circle. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped out. He held a thick sealed envelope in his hands. Even from 30 yards away, I could see the heavy wax seal and the embossed logo of Vanguard Development. Sterling had promised the final escrow documents would be delivered on Saturday, but corporate lawyers rarely waited when $88 million was on the line. They wanted the paperwork secured and the terms locked in stone. The courier adjusted his tie and looked around, searching for the main office. Brittany immediately altered her path. Her radar for wealth and status was finely tuned, and the courier reeked of high-end corporate money. She practically jogged over to him, flashing a bright artificial smile. She adjusted her oversized sun hat and crossed her arms, adopting the posture of a woman who owned the ground she stood on. "Can I help you?" Brittany asked, her tone dripping with false sweetness. The courier glanced at his clipboard. "I have a highly confidential delivery for Abigail Wilson. It requires an authorized signature and immediate secure placement." Brittany let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, Abigail is currently mucking out the stalls or dealing with some farm crisis. She is my sister. I am overseeing the property logistics this weekend. I can take that off your hands. We are actually hosting a massive luxury event here, so you can imagine how overwhelmed she is with the actual manual labor." The courier hesitated, clutching the thick envelope against his chest. The instructions were to deliver it directly to the property owner. "It is highly sensitive legal documentation. I am the property owner family." Brittany snapped, her artificial smile vanishing, instantly replaced by the harsh, demanding glare she had inherited directly from Beverly. "I said I will take it. Do not make me call your supervisor. We are very busy people and I do not have time to hunt down farmhands." The courier, likely a junior associate, terrified of offending a wealthy client, yielded to her aggressive entitlement. He handed over the thick envelope and a digital signing pad. Brittany scribbled an illegible signature, shooed the man away with a flick of her wrist, and turned her back before his car even pulled out of the circle. I stood in the shadow of the veterinary clinic awning, perfectly concealed, watching my sister. I could have stepped out. I could have marched across the cobblestones, snatched the documents from her manicured hands, and ordered her off my property for intercepting my legal mail. But I did not move a muscle. The trap was springing itself, and the timing was far too beautiful to interrupt. Brittany stared at the heavy envelope. The Vanguard Development seal clearly meant nothing to her, but the words "highly confidential" printed in bright red ink across the top were an irresistible temptation. She looked left and right, ensuring no staff members were watching, completely unaware of my presence just a few dozen yards away. I knew exactly what was running through her mind. She assumed it was a foreclosure notice. She assumed it was a final demand from a bank. She wanted the ammunition to use against me at dinner. With a sharp, aggressive tear, Brittany ripped open the top of the envelope. She pulled out the thick stack of legal documents, flipping impatiently past the cover letter and the non-disclosure agreements. She was searching for a bottom line. A massive debt. A humiliating failure she could parade in front of our parents. Her eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched her posture slowly shift. The arrogant tilt of her shoulders dissolved. She stopped flipping the pages. She froze, completely still, staring at the middle of the second page. The wind rustled through the oak trees, but Brittany did not move. She brought the paperwork closer to her face, her eyes widening behind her designer sunglasses. She read the bold print. She read the property description. She read the itemized list of hyperbaric chambers, surgical suites, and regenerative therapy equipment. She read the transfer of deeds and the corporate acquisitions clauses. And then she read the final purchase agreement. I watched the color completely drain from my sister's face. The chalky, pale shock mirrored the exact expression her husband Derek had worn when he stepped out of the luxury SUV. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. This was not a mud patch. This was not a charity venue for her fake luxury vow renewal to hide her bankruptcy. This was an empire, and she was holding the undeniable proof. $88 million. The number was printed clearly, unmistakably, right above the signature line. The smelly barn she had just demanded I hide was being sold for a sum of money that dwarfed our father's entire net worth. It was money that made her prestigious country club friends look like absolute peasants. It was money that could buy Derek's silence, pay off his massive fraudulent debts, and still leave enough to build a global dynasty. Brittany's hands began to shake violently. The thick pages rattled against each other, echoing in the quiet courtyard. She dropped her designer purse onto the cobblestone, the expensive leather scuffing against the rock. She did not even notice. She just kept staring at the zeros, her mouth falling open in absolute paralyzed horror. Her reality, the delusion that she was the superior, successful sister, was crumbling to dust right in front of her eyes. Mom! Brittany gasped the word, barely a whisper at first. Then louder, a frantic, high-pitched shriek that tore through the quiet farm air. Mom! Dad! Brittany reads the bold print. The smelly barn is being sold for exactly $88,000. She sprints to find her parents. The frantic shrieks echoing across the cobblestones brought Howard and Beverly rushing out of the main house. The heavy oak door banged against the siding as my father stomped down the porch steps, his face flushed with immediate irritation. Beverly followed close behind him, clutching the lapels of her pristine blazer, expecting to find Brittany covered in mud or attacked by a rogue farm animal. Derek trotted nervously in the rear, his face slick with a cold sweat. "What on earth is the matter with you, Brittany?" My father barked, his voice booming across the quiet courtyard. "Stop screeching. You are making a spectacle of yourself." Brittany did not even register his reprimand. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she stumbled forward on her white stilettos. She thrust the thick stack of legal documents directly into Howard's chest. Her hands were shaking so violently, the heavy paper rattled like dry leaves in a hurricane. "Read it!" she gasped, her voice cracking into a breathless sob. "Read the bottom of the second page." Howard snatched the documents with a scowl, pulling his reading glasses from his breast pocket. Beverly leaned over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Derek hung back, too paralyzed by his own financial terror to intervene. I remained perfectly still in the shadow of the clinic awning, watching the scene unfold, with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. Howard's eyes scanned the dense legal text. I watched the exact millisecond his brain processed the string of zeros. The aggressive, impatient flush drained from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly white. He froze, entirely motionless. The air in the courtyard seemed to evaporate. Beverly let out a sharp, strangled gasp, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth. $88 million, my mother breathed, the words slipping past her lips, as if they were holy. 88 million. The transformation was instantaneous and violently grotesque. The disdain, the superiority, the disgust they had harbored for my property vanished in the blink of an eye. Beverly looked up from the paper and stared at the massive steel and glass rehabilitation wing. Suddenly, it was not a smelly barn. It was a cathedral of untold wealth. Her eyes darted across the rolling green pastures and the pristine fencing, greedy calculation replacing her previous horror. "Abigail!" Beverly cried out, her voice suddenly saturated with a frantic, manic excitement. She spun around, searching the courtyard until she spotted me stepping out from the shadow of the awning. "Abigail, this changes everything. The family is saved. You did it." Derek let out a sound that was half sob and half hysterical laugh. He actually dropped to his knees on the cobblestones, burying his face in his hands. The crushing weight of his fraudulent investments, his impending bankruptcy, and the absolute social ruin hanging over his head was instantly lifted. He wept openly, a pathetic display of relief from a man who had planned to use my home as a stage to mask his failures. Brittany was already pacing her heels, clicking erratically. "We can fix Derek mess," she babbled, her eyes wide and feverish. "We can pay off the Dubai investors tomorrow. We can upgrade the vow renewal. I want the caterers from Manhattan. I want the vintage champagne imported. We can buy that estate in the Hamptons." We looked at Derek. "We are untouchable." Howard did not weep and he did not babble. He did what he had always done. He immediately aggressively seized control. He slapped the contract against his palm, his chest puffing out as the color returned to his face. The shock had passed, replaced entirely by the arrogant certainty of a man who believed the world existed solely to serve him. "All right, listen to me," Howard commanded, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He looked at Brittany and Derek, then turned his piercing gaze to my mother. "Beverly, call Sterling at the wealth management firm immediately. Tell him we are bringing in a massive liquidity event. We need to restructure the entire family portfolio by Monday morning." He turned toward Derek, who was still kneeling on the ground. "Get up, Derek. Have some dignity, for God's sake. I will personally wire the funds to clear your outstanding debts the moment this cash clears escrow. We wipe the slate clean. No more amateur hour investments. From now on, you run everything through my office." Howard then turned to Brittany, a proud, indulgent smile on his face. "And you, sweetheart, you will get your Hamptons house. You will get your Manhattan townhouse. You deserve it for enduring this stress. We will handle all of it." Finally, my father turned to face me. I walked slowly across the cobblestones, closing the distance between us. I did not look like a woman who had just secured generational wealth. I looked entirely bored. Howard held up the contract, tapping the front page with a thick finger. "Now, Abigail," he began, his tone shifting into a patronizing, deeply insulting register. "We need to talk about logistics. Obviously, a sum of this magnitude requires sophisticated management. You have done a nice job dressing up this property, but navigating an $88 million liquidity event is beyond your scope. We will set up a family trust. I will act as the primary trustee and executor. We will put the capital into diversified, aggressive growth portfolios under my direct supervision. You will, of course, receive a very generous monthly stipend, more than enough to keep you and the twins comfortable wherever you decide to move next." He said it with such absolute conviction that I almost admired his delusion. He genuinely believed that my money was his money. He genuinely believed that my 6 years of blood, sweat, and tears were merely a preamble to his ultimate victory. "It is only fair," Howard demanded, stepping closer to me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me into submission. "We raised you, Abigail. We put a roof over your head. We paid for your education. We gave you the business sense and the pedigree to even pull something like this off. You would not have had the foundation to build this without the Wilson name. This is a family victory, and it will be managed by the head of the family." Beverly nodded vigorously, stepping up to stand shoulder to shoulder with my father. "Your father is right, Abigail. This is a blessing. It wipes away all the unpleasantness of the last few years. You can finally stop playing farmer and come back to Boston where you belong. We will manage the heavy lifting. You just need to sign the transfer authorizations." I stopped walking when I was exactly 2 feet away from my father. I looked at his flushed, excited face. I looked at my mother, desperate, greedy smile. I looked at Brittany, who was already visualizing the interior design of her imaginary Hamptons estate. And I looked at Derek, who was wiping tears of relief from his pale cheeks. They had spent the entire morning insulting my home, threatening to displace my children, and treating me like the hired help. And the absolute second they smelled money, they had devoured it like starving wolves, completely convinced it belonged to them. I reached out my hand, perfectly steady. I grasped the edge of the blue cardstock folder. Howard held onto it for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening instinctively. I locked eyes with him, my expression as cold and unforgiving as a winter freeze. I did not blink. I did not break eye contact. Slowly, Howard loosened his grip. I slid the $88 million contract smoothly out of his hands. I did not scream. I did not call him a thief or a delusional narcissist. I did not defend my business sense or remind him that he had thrown me to the wolves when Liam died. Emotional reactions were exactly what they expected. Emotional reactions meant they still had power over me. I gave them absolutely nothing but ice. I smoothed the crumpled edge of the contract against my thigh. I am glad you are all so excited, I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, silky hum that forced them to lean in to hear me. It is a remarkable achievement. Vanguard Development has been acquiring the surrounding acreage for months. They recognize that this facility is the pinnacle of equine rehabilitation in North America. They understand the value of what I have built. Of course they do, Beverly interrupted, her voice trembling with impatience. But Abigail, the trust documents. We need to get the lawyers on the phone today. I held up a single finger, silencing her instantly. The deal is not finalized yet, Mom, I said, my voice perfectly smooth, tracking the sudden flash of anxiety that crossed her face. A contract of this magnitude requires a highly secure closing process. The escrow accounts are still being verified. The final inspections are happening this week. Nothing is set in stone until the ink dries on the final page. Howard frowned, his thick eyebrows drawing together. When is the closing date? He demanded. We need to know exactly when the capital will be liquid. Derek has deadlines. I looked down at the contract, pretending to verify a detail I had already memorized down to the second. I let the silence stretch out, letting their anticipation peak until it was almost unbearable. Then I looked back up directly into Brittany's wide, greedy eyes. The final signing is scheduled for this coming Saturday. I said, my words clipping through the air with devastating precision. The Vanguard executive team and their legal counsel are flying in from New York. They will be arriving at the main gates exactly at 7 o'clock in the evening. The wire transfer hits the account the moment the final signature is secured. Brittany's jaw dropped open. 7 o'clock, she repeated, her voice a hollow, breathless echo. I smiled. It was a sharp, terrifying expression. Yes, Brittany, 7 o'clock. The exact time her lavish 200-guest vow renewal ceremony was scheduled to begin. The exact moment the mayor, the country club elite, and her high society friends would be seated on my lawn, waiting for a fake celebration of a bankrupt marriage. The exact moment a fleet of black corporate SUVs would roll through my gates, carrying an army of lawyers ready to hand me a check for $88 million. Of course, Mom, I said smoothly, turning my cold smile toward Beverly. I would love to host the family this weekend. It is going to be an unforgettable evening. I turned on my heel, the blue folder clutched in my hand, and walked back toward my office, leaving them standing in the middle of the cobblestone courtyard, entirely trapped in a web of their own making. They could not cancel the vow renewal without exposing their financial ruin, and they could not stop the corporate buyout that was about to happen right in front of their faces. They were locked in, and I held the only key. Saturday was going to be a spectacular execution. I just needed to prepare the stage. Once inside my office, I locked the heavy oak door and walked straight to the wall safe hidden behind a framed photograph of Liam. The confrontation in the courtyard had gone exactly as I anticipated. Howard's arrogant declaration that he would simply seize my $88 million and distribute it to his preferred children was entirely predictable. However, Howard was a businessman. He knew that demanding money and legally controlling it were two entirely different things. He would never simply wait for Saturday evening to roll around. He would demand leverage. He would look for a way to force my hand. And Derek, drowning in the sea of fraudulent debt, would be the rat sent to fetch it. I spun the dial on the safe and pulled the heavy steel door open. I dug through the archival boxes, pulling out files from the darkest period of my life. I was looking for the original estate planning drafts from the months immediately following my marriage to Liam. Liam's previous lawyer had been an archaic, deeply conservative man who insisted on protecting family assets from outsiders. He had drafted a completely unsolicited addendum, suggesting that in the event of Liam's premature death, should I ever attempt to liquidate the primary Vanguard Farm assets, control of the sale and the resulting capital would automatically revert to a designated male patriarch or a managing family trust. Liam had fired that lawyer the very next day. The document was completely worthless, never notarized, never signed, and legally superseded by our airtight, ironclad trust. But to a desperate man looking for a lifeline, it would look like an absolute golden ticket. The legal jargon was dense, intimidating, and heavily favored paternal control. I placed the pale yellow addendum casually on my desk, leaving it deliberately peeking out from under a stack of feed invoices. I unlocked my office door, leaving it open just a fraction of an inch. Then I walked out the side exit and headed straight to the security control room in the adjoining building. I sat in front of those glowing monitors and waited. It took exactly 14 minutes. On camera 4, I watched Derek practically creeping down the administrative hallway. He looked pathetic. His expensive suit was rumpled and nervous sweat plastered his thinning hair to his forehead. He paused at my office door, looking over his shoulder like a frightened rabbit before slipping inside. I switched the feed to the interior office camera. Derek's hands were shaking violently as he began pulling open my desk drawers. He riffled through patient files and veterinary contracts, his panic visibly mounting when he found nothing related to Vanguard development or corporate buyouts. I was breathing heavily, wiping his brow with the back of his sleeve. Then his elbow bumped the stack of invoices. The heavy yellow paper of the addendum slid out. Derek snatched it up. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. I could practically pinpoint the exact second he read the patriarchal reversion clause. His mouth fell open. He let out a ragged, audible gasp of pure relief. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, and his hands were trembling so badly he almost dropped the device. He snapped several high-resolution photos of every single page. He did not bother to read the dates. He did not look for a notary seal. He was completely blinded by his own salvation. Driven entirely by greed, Derek shoved the phone back into his pocket, pushed the addendum back under the invoices, and scurried out of the office as fast as his legs could carry him. I leaned back in my leather chair, letting out a soft, cold laugh. The bait was taken. I pulled up the exterior courtyard feed. Derek was jogging back to the main house where Howard, Beverly, and Brittany were huddled on the porch, pacing like caged tigers. Derek practically shoved his phone into Howard's face, pointing frantically at the glowing screen. Howard snatched the phone. He adjusted his reading glasses and squinted at the photographs. I watched my father's posture undergo a violent transformation. The lingering anxiety from my defiance evaporated entirely. His chest expanded, his shoulders pulled back, and a massive triumphant grin spread across his face. He slapped Derek hard on the back, a gesture of masculine approval that Derek looked absolutely desperate to receive. Howard then turned the screen to show Beverly and Brittany pointing at the specific paragraphs. They had their loophole. In their greedy minds, the $88 million was no longer just a possibility. It was legally, rightfully, and completely theirs to control. They were already spending phantom millions congratulating themselves on their own brilliant strategy. I stood up from the security monitors, turning off the screens. It was time to go back outside. The real guests of honor were scheduled to arrive, and I needed to greet them before my family completely poisoned the atmosphere. I walked out of the security building just as a reliable, slightly weathered Ford pickup truck turned down the main driveway. The truck bypassed the arrogant black luxury SUV parked in the circle and pulled neatly into a designated spot near the residence. David and Karen stepped out of the truck. They were Liam's parents, and they were everything my own parents were not. David wore worn denim jeans and a heavy flannel shirt, his face deeply lined from years of working outdoors. Karen wore a simple knit sweater, her warm eyes already scanning the property with genuine love and pride. They had been my anchor when Liam died. They had helped me mend fences, watch the twins, and rebuild this farm when my own blood had turned their backs on me. David reached into the bed of the pickup truck, pulling out a large cardboard box filled with vintage string lights and handmade rustic centerpieces. Karen carried a massive aluminum tray covered in foil, the rich scent of her famous roasted garlic chicken wafting through the crisp Kentucky air. They had come a full week early to help me prepare for the influx of clients and to ensure the twins were cared for during the chaos of the weekend. I started walking toward them, a genuine smile finally breaking through the cold armor I had been forced to wear all morning. David, Karen. I called out, waving my hand as I crossed the grass. Before they could respond or even turn around, the front door of the main house flew open with a loud bang. Beverly marched out onto the porch, her posture rigid with fresh, intoxicating arrogance. The fake legal loophole sitting on Derek's phone had injected her with a lethal dose of superiority. She looked down at David and Karen as if they had just tracked fresh manure onto a white silk carpet. Beverly descended the porch steps, her heels clicking aggressively against the wood. She intentionally positioned herself between me and my in-laws, crossing her arms tightly over her pristine designer blazer. "What exactly are you two doing here?" Beverly demanded, her voice sharp and dripping with absolute disgust. David paused, adjusting the heavy box in his arms. He looked at Beverly with mild confusion, offering a polite nod. "Hello, Beverly. We came to help Abigail set up for the weekend. We brought the extra decorations she asked for, and some dinner for the staff." Beverly let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed loudly across the courtyard. She waved her manicured hand dismissively at the homemade food and the humble cardboard boxes. "We do not need your little craft projects," David. Beverly sneered, her nose wrinkling in distaste. "And we certainly do not need your casseroles. We are hosting a high society event this weekend. Brittany has an elite decorator flying in directly from New York. We are dealing in millions now, not whatever pocket change you two scrape together to pretend you are helpful." Karen stepped forward, her brow furrowing in confusion and hurt. "Beverly, we are just here to help our daughter-in-law. There is absolutely no need for that tone. She is not your daughter-in-law anymore." Beverly snapped, her voice turning vicious and loud. "Your son is dead. Abigail is a Wilson, and she is finally returning to her proper station in life. We are taking complete control of this property and its assets today. The days of Abigail playing in the dirt with you people are officially over." David's jaw tightened, but he maintained his quiet dignity, shifting the box in his hands. "Abigail invited us, Beverly. We are family." Beverly's eyes flashed with manic, greedy excitement. She took a step closer to David, pointing a sharp, aggressive finger toward the back maintenance fields of the property. "You are not family," Beverly hissed, her voice echoing with venomous pride. "You are a tragic reminder of a terrible mistake. So take your little cardboard boxes and your aluminum trays and go sit out back with the hired help. The real family is about to become filthy rich, and we do not want you getting in the way." David's face tightened, his grip on the cardboard box turning his knuckles white. I stepped out from the shadow of the awning before he could respond, placing a gentle, reassuring hand on his arm. I looked directly into Beverly's manic, dilated eyes. "David and Karen are my guests, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm and entirely devoid of the intimidation she clearly expected. "They will sit wherever I tell them to sit." Beverly scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. She turned on her heel and marched back into the main house, eager to resume planning her imaginary empire with Howard and Derek. I turned to my in-laws, watching the hurt ripple across Karen's gentle face. "Just play along until Saturday evening," I whispered, squeezing David's arm. "I promise you it will be worth the wait. They are digging their own graves, and I am going to let them keep shoveling." Saturday evening arrived, bringing with it an obscenely lavish transformation of my working property. Brittany had flown in a team of high-end event decorators from Manhattan who had worked frantically for 2 days straight to mask the reality of a working equine facility. They draped the entire central courtyard in miles of sheer white chiffon and suspended massive, shimmering crystal chandeliers from the reinforced steel rafters of the open-air pavilion. It looked exactly like what it was: a desperate, highly expensive illusion designed to completely obscure total financial ruin. By 6 o'clock, the imported cobblestone driveway was packed shoulder to shoulder with a fleet of luxury vehicles. Valets sprinted back and forth, parking Bentleys, Maseratis, and armored SUVs. Over 200 of Boston and Kentucky's most elite high society figures stepped out onto my manicured lawns. There were prominent local politicians, ruthless country club investors, and wealthy socialites, all lured here by the promise of an exclusive, opulent vow renewal. They mingled under the fading evening sun, sipping vintage champagne that Derek had undoubtedly purchased using a high-interest credit card he could never hope to pay off. Brittany made her grand appearance precisely at 6:30. She descended the main house staircase wearing a custom $15,000 silk gown that pooled around her feet like liquid silver. She paraded through the crowd with the absolute breathtaking arrogance of a queen inspecting her loyal subjects. She genuinely believed that the $88 million contract she had illegally intercepted was destined directly for her bank account. She threw her head back, laughing far too loudly at polite jokes, holding her crystal champagne flute like a royal scepter. Derek trailed slightly behind her, wearing a strained, sweaty smile. His designer tuxedo looked a size too small around his neck. The fake addendum he had found in my safe had given him a temporary lifeline, but the anxiety of his actual crushing debt still lurked right behind his darting eyes. He kept looking toward the front gates, checking his watch every 3 minutes, waiting for the corporate lawyers to arrive with his salvation. While Brittany soaked in the superficial attention, my parents were hard at work, securing their new imaginary dynasty. Howard had successfully cornered the local mayor and a group of highly influential real estate investors near a towering ice sculpture. I stood quietly in the wings, leaning against a cool stone pillar, holding a simple glass of sparkling water. I was perfectly positioned in the shadows, allowing me to hear every single word of his performance. It is all about long-term vision, Howard boasted loudly, making sure his booming voice carried over the classical string quartet playing in the background. When Abigail first acquired this land, it was absolutely nothing, just dirt and liability. Her late husband lacked the fortitude to build a real business. But I stepped in. I orchestrated the development strategy. I personally guided the capital investments. And now we are closing a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. The mayor raised his eyebrows, suitably impressed, taking a slow sip of his drink. A corporate buyout, Howard. That sounds incredibly substantial. $88 million, Howard declared, puffing out his chest so far the buttons on his tuxedo vest visibly strained. Vanguard Development. The deal closes tonight right here on this property. I structured the entire family trust myself to ensure the capital is completely protected and maximized for our dynasty. You have to actively guide the younger generation, you understand. Left to her own devices, my daughter would have given the entire fortune away to animal charities and farmhands. The investors chuckled, nodding in polite agreement, completely swallowing the lie. Howard was explicitly claiming ownership of my life work, my grueling negotiations, and my entire financial future in front of the most influential people in the state. He was wrapping the rope tightly around his own neck and eagerly tying the knot. Across the pavilion, Beverly was putting on a shockingly similar performance for the country club wives. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that I knew for an absolute fact was heavily insured and heavily mortgaged. "We are touring private estates in the Hamptons next week," Beverly bragged, swirling her champagne and leaning in close to a senator wife. This little farm project was a nice quiet distraction for Abigail after her husband passed, but it is time for her to return to civilization. Howard and I have facilitated this massive sale so we can finally consolidate the family wealth. We are bringing Brittany and Derek into the primary holding company as managing partners. It is an entirely new era for the Wilsons. We are ascending. I took a slow sip of my water. I did not intervene. I did not step forward to correct their aggressive delusions. Every arrogant boast, every loud public declaration of their imaginary wealth was another solid nail driven into their social coffin. They were building a massive, glittering tower of complete lies, and I was going to let them climb all the way to the very top before I kicked the foundation out from under them. As the clock inched closer to 7, the frantic event planner began directing the wealthy guests toward the VIP dining area. It was a spectacular setup located inside the renovated glass atrium. Long, heavy tables were covered in silver silk and adorned with towering, extravagant floral centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids. The catering staff, dressed in crisp black and white uniforms, stood at strict attention near the entrance, holding silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The atmosphere inside the atrium was thick with the scent of heavy perfume, roasted truffles, and unchecked entitlement. Howard and Beverly naturally positioned themselves directly at the entrance of the VIP area, acting as the ultimate gatekeepers to this exclusive domain. They greeted the elite guests with wide, gracious smiles, ushering the politicians and billionaires toward their assigned seats with practiced ease. I remained near the caterer's station, observing the flow of the crowd. The sun had finally dipped entirely below the horizon, casting a deep purple twilight glow over the farm. The heavy iron security gates at the front of the property remained locked open, waiting for the corporate convoy that was currently speeding down the highway toward my home. Through the thick crowd of glittering gowns and tailored tuxedos, I spotted David and Karen. Liam's parents looked entirely out of place in the sea of high society wealth, yet they possessed a quiet, grounded dignity that none of the surrounding guests could ever hope to replicate. David wore his best suit, an older traditional cut, but meticulously pressed. Karen wore a lovely simple navy dress, her silver hair pinned back elegantly. They had spent the entire afternoon helping my staff manage the anxious horses in the back barns, ensuring the animals were completely unaffected by the noise and chaos of Brittany's extravagant party. They walked together toward the glass atrium, intending to find their seats for the dinner service. They were my guests of honor. I had specifically placed their names at my personal table right at the front of the room. Before they could even reach the glass doors, Beverly stepped directly into their path. She moved with sudden aggressive speed, her diamond necklace flashing under the overhead atrium lights. She held up her hand, her palm facing David's chest, physically blocking him from taking another step into the room. The polite, gracious smile she had been flashing to the wealthy investors vanished in an instant, replaced by a look of profound elitist disgust. "Excuse me," Beverly said, her voice intentionally loud enough to draw the immediate attention of the nearby guests and the frozen catering staff. "Where exactly do you think you are going?" David stopped, pulling Karen slightly behind his shoulder. He looked at Beverly with a mixture of immense patience and deep weariness. "We are going to our seats, Beverly. Abigail told us the dinner service was starting." Beverly let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through the ambient chatter of the room like a physical blade. Several high-profile guests turned their heads, their conversations halting completely as they watched the confrontation unfold. "You are absolutely not coming into the VIP dining room," Beverly stated, her tone dripping with venomous superiority. "This area is strictly reserved for the Wilson family and our distinguished high-net-worth guests. We are celebrating a massive financial victory tonight, David. We are dealing with 8-figure corporate acquisitions. This is not a rural community potluck." Karen's face flushed a deep, painful crimson with humiliation. She looked down at the polished floor, clutching her small, worn purse tightly against her side. David's jaw locked, his eyes narrowing as he stared down, my mother refusing to be intimidated. "We are Abigail family," David said quietly, refusing to raise his voice or cause a scene in front of the crowd. "Liam was our son. Liam is dead." Beverly snapped, her cruelty echoing loudly off the glass walls of the atrium, shocking even some of the seasoned socialites. "And his pathetic ties to our money died with him. I told you yesterday to go sit out back with the farmhands where you belong. We have the mayor inside this room. We have international billionaires. I will not have you two tracking mud into our celebration and embarrassing us in front of people who actually matter. Now turn around and go find a paper plate in the staff kitchen before I have security physically escort you off my property." I stepped out from behind the towering floral arrangement just as Beverly finished her vicious tirade. My mother stood there vibrating with toxic superiority, her chin raised and her eyes hard. David had instinctively stepped in front of Karen, his broad shoulders tense, bracing for a fight he did not want to have in front of a crowd. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I simply walked directly into Beverly's line of sight, breaking her aggressive stance with the sheer coldness of my presence. "You are entirely mistaken, Mom," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority that instantly froze the smirk on her face. "They are not sitting out back." Before Beverly could formulate a response, I reached out and gently took David and Karen by the arms. I guided them forward, stepping deliberately close to my mother, forcing her to take an awkward, stumbling step backward in her high heels to avoid a collision. She let out a sharp, offended gasp, but she was completely trapped. The mayor and his wife were standing less than 10 feet away, watching us with mild curiosity. Beverly could not scream. She could not throw a tantrum. She was chained by her own desperate need to maintain her high society facade. "Come with me," I said, keeping my voice warm and steady for my in-laws. "We have a special table waiting for you." I led them straight through the center of the glass atrium. Hundreds of wealthy elite guests turned to watch us. David and Karen, in their simple, modest clothing, stood out starkly against the sea of designer silk and diamond necklaces. I could hear the hushed whispers and the quiet murmurs of the country club investors, wondering who these rustic people were. I held my head high, radiating absolute ownership of the space. I walked them past the secondary tables, past the loud politicians, and past my seething parents who were forced to follow in our wake. I brought David and Karen to the absolute center of the room, to the primary owner table positioned directly in front of the small stage. It was the best seat in the house. I pulled out Karen's chair myself, ignoring the furious glare Howard shot me as he realized he and Beverly would have to sit at the adjacent table. We sat down, and the catering staff immediately descended upon us, pouring water and offering appetizers. David looked around the opulent room, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and deep discomfort. Karen reached under the table and squeezed my hand. "Abigail, you do not have to do this," Karen whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "We do not want to cause trouble with your family. We can eat in the kitchen. We really do not mind." I squeezed her hand back, my gaze remaining fixed on Howard and Beverly, who were currently forcing tight, painful smiles for the surrounding billionaires. "You are exactly where you belong, Karen," I replied softly. "Just enjoy the dinner. I promise you this is going to be the most entertaining evening of their entire lives." The dinner service commenced in a flurry of silver trays and popping champagne corks. The atmosphere inside the glass atrium was suffocatingly rich. The wealthy elite of Boston and Kentucky mingled seamlessly, their conversations dominated by stock portfolios, overseas investments, and country club gossip. My parents worked the room like seasoned politicians. Howard was in his element, slapping backs and shaking hands, acting as the benevolent patriarch of a rising dynasty. Beverly glided from table to table, touching shoulders and accepting compliments on the extravagant decor, taking full credit for the venue she had despised just days earlier. Derek sat at the head table, completely silent. He was drinking heavily, downing glass after glass of vintage wine. The heavy designer tuxedo looked like it was choking him. His face was slick with a persistent cold sweat, and his eyes darted nervously toward the large glass doors every few minutes. He was a man waiting for a pardon from the governor, terrified that the executioner might arrive first. When the final plates were cleared and the dessert wine was poured, the lights in the atrium dimmed slightly. A single spotlight illuminated the small stage at the front of the room. The low murmur of high society chatter faded into an expectant silence. Brittany stood up from her seat at the head table. She smoothed the skirt of her $15,000 custom silk gown, a dress purchased entirely on a mountain of fraudulent credit. She picked up a crystal champagne flute and a silver spoon, tapping the glass repeatedly until the crisp, ringing sound commanded the absolute attention of every single person in the room. She glided up the short steps to the stage, taking the microphone from the stand. She looked out over the sea of faces, her chest heaving with a deep, intoxicating pride. She genuinely believed she had won. She believed the fake Derek had found in my office was the ultimate weapon, and that the massive fortune was already sitting securely in her bank account. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Brittany began, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. Her smile was blindingly bright, completely masking the rotting foundation of her marriage. "Derek and I are so incredibly blessed to celebrate our love with all of you. 10 years ago, we promised to support each other through thick and thin. And let me tell you, building a successful life together requires vision, it requires strength, and most importantly, it requires family." She paused, letting the word hang in the air. She looked directly at Howard and Beverly, who were beaming at her from their seats. Then her gaze shifted to me. Her smile sharpened, turning into a weapon. "Family is everything to the Wilsons." Brittany continued, her tone dripping with a sickly sweet condescension. "We protect our own. And tonight I want to take a moment to acknowledge my parents, Howard and Beverly. Because tonight is not just a celebration of my marriage. Tonight is a celebration of our family enduring legacy and our incredible generosity." A low murmur of curiosity rippled through the crowd. The mayor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, clearly intrigued. David and Karen shifted uncomfortably beside me, but I simply took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching my sister dig her grave with a golden shovel. As many of you know, my younger sister Abigail has had a very difficult few years, Brittany said, her voice dropping into a register of mock sympathy. After she lost her husband, she retreated here to the country. She tried her very best to run this little farm. She got her hands dirty. She worked in the mud. She struggled to keep things afloat. But the business world is harsh, and passion is rarely enough to pay the bills. Brittany let out a soft, theatrical sigh, shaking her head, as if burdened by my tragic incompetence. I watched Howard puff out his chest, nodding in solemn agreement with his daughter's fabricated narrative. But the Wilsons do not let their own fail, Brittany declared, her voice rising with dramatic triumph. We step in. My father, a brilliant businessman, recognized that Abigail needed rescuing. He saw that this property had potential if it was managed by someone with actual corporate expertise. So Howard rolled up his sleeves. He took control of the negotiations. He orchestrated the development strategy. And because of his brilliance and my mother's unwavering support, I am thrilled to announce that tonight, right here on this property, we are officially closing a massive corporate buyout. The crowd gasped. Whispers of excitement and shock swept through the tables. Brittany held up her free hand, pausing for dramatic effect. My parents have successfully negotiated an $88 million sale of this estate. Brittany announced, her voice trembling with manic greedy joy. The room erupted. The country club investors let out loud appreciative whistles. The politicians clapped enthusiastically. A wave of thunderous applause washed over the glass atrium. Howard stood up from his chair, buttoning his tuxedo jacket. He offered a humble, gracious bow to the clapping billionaires, waving his hand as if deflecting the praise he had explicitly orchestrated. Beverly remained seated, but she pressed a lace handkerchief to her eyes, playing the role of the overwhelmed, benevolent matriarch to absolute perfection. Yes, Brittany shouted over the applause, her face flushed with victory. $88 million. We are taking the capital and establishing a new family trust. My father will oversee the investments, ensuring that our dynasty continues to grow. And most importantly, we are finally bringing Abigail back home to Boston, where we can take care of her properly. No more struggling in the mud, no more farm chores. She is safe now because her family stepped in to save her. The crowd clapped harder, completely captivated by the heartwarming story of the wealthy, benevolent parents rescuing their tragic, incompetent daughter. Several guests at the adjacent tables raised their glasses to Howard and Beverly, toasting their remarkable business acumen and their profound family loyalty. David turned to me, his face tight with anger. Abigail, he whispered, leaning close so only I could hear. What is she doing? She is completely humiliating you. This is your business. You built this. Why are you letting them take the credit? I set my water glass down on the table. My heart rate was perfectly steady. My hands were completely still. I looked at David and offered him a small, chilling smile. I am letting them take the credit, David, because pride is a very heavy anchor, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. And when they finally fall, they are going to sink straight to the absolute bottom. Watch the doors. On the stage, Brittany raised her champagne flute high into the air. So please raise your glasses to Howard and Beverly Wilson, she commanded, her voice ringing with absolute supreme arrogance. To family, to legacy, and to a very, very wealthy future. The crowd raised their glasses, echoing the toast in a loud, unified chorus. Howard and Beverly clinked their glasses together, their faces radiant with greed and unearned triumph. Derek took a massive gulp of his wine, his eyes frantically darting toward the entrance. As the final echoes of the toast faded into the high ceilings, the heavy iron security gates at the front of the property buzzed with a loud, sharp electronic crack. The sound cut through the ambient noise of the room. I turned my head slightly, watching through the massive glass walls of the atrium. A fleet of 4 sleek, jet-black corporate SUVs rolled smoothly up the imported cobblestone driveway. Their headlights swept across the glass, casting long, dramatic shadows across the white chiffon drapery. The vehicles parked in perfect unison in the administrative circle. The heavy glass doors of the atrium swung open, letting in a rush of cool evening air. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low chatter of the 200 guests died away entirely, replaced by a sudden thick silence as the newcomers stepped into the room. They did not look like wedding guests. They moved with the synchronized, predatory precision of a corporate execution squad. There were 6 of them, all dressed in sharp, impeccable charcoal suits. At the center of the group leading the formation was a tall, strikingly sharp woman with silver hair pulled back into a severe twist. She moved with absolute no-nonsense authority, carrying a gleaming silver briefcase chained to her wrist. She was the senior executive legal counsel for Vanguard Development, and she was not here to deal with Howard Wilson. She was here to finalize the acquisition of an empire. The time for the live signing had officially arrived. The silver-haired executive did not pause to admire the white chiffon drapery or the glittering crystal chandeliers. She moved through the packed atrium with the clinical precision of a predator, zeroing in on its target. The 5 men in charcoal suits fanned out behind her, forming a subtle but impenetrable wall that effectively isolated the main stage from the rest of the dining area. The wealthy guests parted like the Red Sea, intuitively sensing that this woman commanded more actual power than anyone else in the room combined. Howard was practically vibrating with greed. He hastily buttoned his tuxedo jacket and puffed out his chest, preparing to cement his imaginary coronation. He stepped down from the head table and strode directly toward the center of the stage, intercepting the Vanguard executive before she could even reach the microphone stand. He projected an aura of absolute patriarchal authority, flashing a wide, practiced smile designed to charm boardrooms and country clubs alike. "Welcome to my estate," Howard bellowed, his voice carrying effortlessly across the silent room. "I am Howard Wilson, the patriarch of this family and the principal architect of this acquisition. We have a spectacular celebration prepared for you tonight. I see you brought the final contracts. Let us get this paperwork signed and move on to the champagne, shall we?" He confidently extended his hand, expecting the executive to eagerly shake it. He then reached out with his other hand, gesturing toward the gleaming silver briefcase chained to her wrist. He actually snapped his fingers at one of the charcoal-suited men, demanding a pen. The silver-haired executive stopped dead in her tracks. She did not take his extended hand. She did not offer a polite corporate greeting. She simply stared at his outstretched palm with an expression of profound clinical disgust. She looked him up and down, taking in his strained tuxedo and his arrogant posture as if she were examining a particularly unpleasant stain on the heel of her shoe. She unclasped the silver briefcase with a sharp metallic click, resting it on the edge of the nearest table. She opened it and withdrew a thick stack of legal documents bound in heavy blue cardstock. Howard eagerly stepped forward, reaching for the top page, pulling a gold-plated fountain pen from his inner jacket pocket with a flourish. "I will sign on behalf of the Wilson Family Trust," Howard announced loudly, ensuring the mayor and the local investors heard every single word. "Just show me where you need my authorization." The executive snapped the folder shut, pulling it swiftly out of his reach. The sharp cracking sound of the heavy paper echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "Excuse me," the executive said, her voice dropping the temperature in the atrium by 10 degrees. "Who exactly are you?" Howard's arrogant smile froze. The gold pen hovered uselessly in the air. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Beverly half stood from her chair, her diamond necklace catching the light as her jaw went slack. Brittany lowered her champagne flute, her manic, triumphant expression instantly replaced by sheer, utter confusion. "I am Howard Wilson," my father repeated, his voice losing a fraction of its booming confidence. "I am the head of this family. I orchestrated this $88 million buyout. I am here to execute the sale of this property." The executive looked at him with an expression of absolute freezing contempt. She adjusted her glasses and glanced down at the front page of her legal briefing. "I have absolutely no idea who you are, Mr. Wilson," she stated, her voice projecting clearly to every corner of the room. "Your name appears nowhere on any of these deeds titles or corporate acquisition contracts. You do not own this land. You do not hold any equity in this business. And you certainly do not possess the legal authority to sell a single blade of grass on this property. Now step aside. I need the sole owner of this empire." The crowd fell completely dead silent. The heavy, suffocating quiet was so absolute you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. The mayor exchanged a rapid, alarmed glance with the local real estate investors, who had just spent the last hour listening to Howard boast about his masterful negotiations. The high society wives who had been fawning over Beverly suddenly leaned away from her, their eyes wide with scandalized shock. Howard stood frozen on the stage, his arm still outstretched, his gold pen completely useless. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a pale, sickly shade of gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The grand illusion he had built, the magnificent towering lie of his absolute control, was disintegrating into dust, right in front of the most influential people in the state. I stepped out from the shadows near the catering station. I did not rush. I walked with slow, measured, deliberate steps. I bypassed the stunned catering staff. I walked past the gaping politicians and the whispering socialites. I walked directly past Beverly, who was gripping the edge of her table so hard her knuckles were bone white. I ascended the short steps to the stage, my boots sounding a steady rhythmic beat against the wood. Brittany backed away from me, her eyes darting frantically between my face and the Vanguard executive. I reached out and calmly took the microphone directly from her trembling hands. "Good evening, Miss Sterling," I said, my voice steady, powerful, and commanding. "I apologize for the confusion. My father has a terrible habit of inserting himself into business matters that do not concern him. I am ready to finalize the sale." Emma's Sterling's sharp, severe features instantly softened into a look of profound professional respect. She completely ignored Howard stepping around his frozen form to approach me. She extended her hand and I shook it firmly. "It is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person, Abigail," Miss Sterling said, her voice carrying a warmth she had entirely denied my father. "Your development plans are brilliant. Vanguard has been trying to acquire a footprint in this region for 3 years, and your strategic consolidation of the surrounding parcels is the most aggressive, masterful real estate play I have seen in a decade. We are thrilled to close this deal with you tonight." The crowd erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. The wealthy elite were rapidly connecting the dots, realizing that the quiet, unassuming widow they had been ignoring all evening was the actual mastermind behind the largest corporate acquisition the county had seen in years. David and Karen sat at the center table, their faces glowing with absolute, unadulterated pride. David wiped a tear from his eye, nodding at me with a fierce, validating smile. Howard finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock. His face flushed a violent, dangerous purple. The sheer humiliation of being publicly dismissed by a corporate executive and bypassed by his own daughter ignited a desperate, terrifying panic inside him. He lunged forward, grabbing the microphone stand. "Wait!" Howard shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "This is illegal. You cannot sign those papers, Abigail. I have the addendum. I have the patriarchal reversion clause." He turned frantically toward the crowd, waving his gold pen in the air. "She is trying to steal the family assets," he roared, practically spitting the words. "She cannot liquidate this farm without my direct authorization. Her late husband drafted a specific addendum, giving me full control over the primary capital in the event of a major sale. It is a legal loophole. Derek found it today." Howard spun around, locking his wild eyes on his son-in-law. "Derek, show them the pictures. Show them the proof." Derek was violently shaking. He fumbled with his suit jacket, pulling out his smartphone. He stumbled up the stairs to the stage, holding the glowing screen out toward Ms. Sterling like a shield. His breathing was ragged, his forehead dripping with nervous sweat. "I have the photos," Derek stammered, his voice pitching upward in sheer terror. "I was in her office. I found the documents hidden in her safe. It says right here that control of the sale automatically reverts to the designated male patriarch. The $88 million belongs to the family trust. Howard is the signatory." Emma Sterling did not even flinch. She slowly turned her head, looking at the glowing smartphone screen in Derek's trembling hand. She leaned in slightly, adjusting her glasses to read the dense legal text displayed on the tiny screen. For 10 agonizing seconds, the entire room held its collective breath. Beverly had risen from her hands clasped together in desperate, fervent prayer. Brittany was holding her breath, her eyes wide and manic, praying that this magical loophole would restore her stolen millions. Ms. Sterling straightened up. She looked at Derek. Then she looked at Howard. And then the senior executive legal counsel for Vanguard Development threw her head back and let out a loud, sharp, barking laugh. It was not a polite corporate chuckle. It was a harsh, genuine laugh of absolute mocking disbelief. The sound cut through Howard's remaining pride like a guillotine blade. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Miss Sterling asked, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of her eye. She pointed a sharp manicured nail at Derek's phone. You are trying to halt an $88 million corporate acquisition with a photograph of an unsigned, unnotarized draft document from 7 years ago. A document that holds absolutely zero legal weight in any court in this country. Howard's jaw dropped. The purple flush on his face vanished, replaced instantly by a horrifying ghostly white. But the reversion clause, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. The patriarchal trust. There is no patriarchal trust, Miss Sterling stated, her voice ringing with absolute finality. That document is a piece of trash. It is a discarded draft that was legally superseded by an ironclad operating agreement the very next day. Abigail has possessed sole uncontested ownership of this entire empire for 6 consecutive years. She does not need your permission, your signature, or your blessing. You have absolutely no power here, Mr. Wilson. You are nothing but a loud man standing on her property. The silence that followed was devastating. It was the sound of a dynasty crumbling into absolute dust. Howard swayed on his feet, his chest heaving as the reality of his profound, humiliating defeat finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his arrogant delusion. I turned my back on my father, leaving him swaying and breathless in the harsh light of his own collapse. I did not give him the satisfaction of another second of my attention. Ms. Sterling stepped up to the podium and placed the heavy blue binder on the polished wood, smoothing the thick pages flat with her hands. She retrieved a sleek silver pen from her jacket pocket, handing it to me with a look of deep professional respect. I leaned over the podium and gripped the pen. I signed my name on the dotted line 4 separate times. With every stroke of ink, I signed away the dirt, the liabilities, the sleepless nights, and the ghosts of the past 6 years. Ms. Sterling closed the binder with a sharp, satisfying snap. She tapped a discreet earpiece hidden beneath her silver hair, listening intently for a brief moment before offering me a sharp, triumphant nod. The wire transfer is complete, Ms. Sterling announced, her voice projecting clearly across the massive atrium. $88 million has successfully cleared into your private holding accounts, Abigail. Vanguard Development officially welcomes you as our newest major shareholder. The crowd, composed of seasoned investors, politicians, and socialites who inherently understood the absolute gravity of liquid capital, erupted. This time the applause was not polite country club clapping. It was a deafening roar of genuine shock and awe. They were looking at me, the woman in the simple dress who had been quietly standing in the shadows, as if I had just conquered a continent. The sheer magnitude of the confirmed sum snapped Beverly out of her paralyzed state. Her brain, wired entirely for social survival and predatory greed, misfired completely. She could not comprehend that she had lost the war. She only saw the money, the applause, and the presence of the mayor. She had to possess it. She had to own the narrative. Beverly shrieked in manufactured delight. She pushed violently past the stunned caterers, practically sprinting up the short stairs to the stage. Her heavy diamond necklace bounced wildly against her collarbone as she threw her arms wide open, aiming directly for me. "Oh, Abigail!" Beverly screamed, tears of fake joy streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "We did it, my beautiful, brilliant daughter. I am so incredibly proud of you. We pulled it off." She reached out to embrace me, ready to present the perfect picture of maternal pride to the flashing cameras of the local elite. I did not step back. I simply raised my right hand, pressing my palm flat and hard against her chest, stopping her dead in her tracks. "Do not touch me," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried a sub-zero temperature that made Beverly physically flinch. Her fake smile faltered, her eyes darting nervously toward the front row. "Abigail, please," she hissed under her breath, a desperate, frantic warning. "Everyone is watching. We are a family. Share this moment." I stepped around her, leaving her frozen awkwardly on the edge of the stage. I gripped the microphone with both hands, looking out at the sea of 200 wealthy guests. The applause died down rapidly, replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. They could sense the impending execution. "My mother wants to share this moment," I said into the microphone, my voice steady and echoing off the glass walls. "She wants to claim credit for my success. She wants all of you to believe that she and my father are the architects of my salvation. She has been walking among your tables tonight, boasting about how they rescued me from the mud. I paused, looking directly at the mayor who had lowered his champagne glass, his expression turning deeply grave. "Let me tell you exactly how my parents rescue their children," I continued. 6 years ago, my husband Liam died in a horrific accident. I was 26 years old, utterly devastated and drowning in $500,000 of sudden medical and farm debt. I lost everything. I was on the verge of losing this very property to foreclosure. A heavy, suffocating silence gripped the room. Nobody moved. Brittany was shrinking into the background, trying to hide behind Derek, who looked like he was about to vomit on his rented tuxedo. "I drove to my parents' immaculate house in Boston," I said, my voice rising with undeniable power. I stood in their pristine foyer with my infant twins in my arms. I was begging. I pleaded with them for a loan. I pleaded with them for a place to sleep just for a few months, so I could get back on my feet. I asked my own mother for a bedroom for her grandsons. I turned my head slowly, locking eyes with Beverly. She was trembling, shaking her head frantically, mouthing the word "no" over and over again. "Do you know what my mother told me?" I asked the crowd. She looked at my crying babies and told me that toddlers would scuff her hardwood floors. She told me that their crying would ruin the peaceful energy of her new Pilates studio. A collective gasp rippled through the VIP section. The wives of the real estate developers stared at Beverly with naked, unadulterated horror. In their world, you might be ruthless in business, but abandoning a widowed daughter with infants was a social crime beyond redemption. "And my father," I said, shifting my gaze to Howard, who was staring at the floor, his entire body deflated, "the great patriarch, the man who claims he orchestrated this buyout." My father walked to his leather wallet, pulled out exactly $500 in cash, and dropped it at my feet. He told me to go find a cheap motel on the highway and figure out my own problems, because failures do not belong in the Wilson family. The disgust in the room was palpable. It radiated from the tables in physical waves. The mayor's wife actively turned her chair away from where Howard was standing, the country club president. A man Howard had been desperately trying to impress for 3 years looked at my father with an expression of absolute revulsion. "They left me to drown," I declared, my voice ringing with total victory. "I built this business with my own 2 hands. I shoveled the stalls. I negotiated the land acquisitions. I survived. I did it completely without them. The only reason they are standing in this room tonight is because they intercepted a confidential courier and invited themselves to my property, hoping to steal the profits of my labor using a fraudulent, expired document." I pointed directly at Derek, exposing him to the crowd. "My brother-in-law is currently facing bankruptcy and massive debt," I revealed, effortlessly dismantling their last shred of dignity. "He broke into my private office this afternoon to photograph discarded drafts, desperately searching for a way to legally seize my money. They are not wealthy investors. They are deeply in debt, socially desperate frauds trying to hijack a fortune they did absolutely nothing to earn." Beverly let out a strangled, pathetic sob. She covered her face with her hands, finally realizing that she had not just lost the money, she had lost her entire social standing. She would never be invited to another gala. She would be a pariah in Boston. Howard looked completely broken, his reputation shredded in front of the very people he worshipped. Brittany had sunk into a chair, staring blankly at the floor, the realization hitting her that she would actually have to pay for her $15,000 dress herself. I let them stew in their absolute destruction for a long moment. The silence was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I had taken their power, their pride, and their future, and I had crushed it under my heel in front of an audience. But vengeance was only half of my plan tonight. I turned my back on my blood relatives. I looked away from the stunned socialites and the horrified politicians. I walked to the edge of the stage, my eyes finding the only 2 people in the room who actually mattered. David and Karen sat perfectly still at the center table. Karen had tears streaming down her face, not tears of humiliation, but tears of profound validation. She was weeping for the justice that had finally been served for her son's memory and for my survival. David sat tall, his chest broad, looking at me with the kind of fierce, unconditional pride that Howard Wilson had never once displayed. I reached into the leather portfolio I had carried to the podium. I bypassed the empty Vanguard binder and pulled out a separate thick stack of legal documents bound with a simple silver clip. These papers had nothing to do with corporate acquisitions or real estate monopolies. I held the documents in my hand, looking directly down at my in-laws preparing to deliver the real shock of the evening. The entire glass atrium was so quiet, I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vents overhead. 200 of the most powerful people in the state were hanging on my every breath. I looked down at the simple silver clip binding the thick stack of parchment paper in my hands. Then I looked at David and Karen. They were sitting frozen at the center table, their faces pale and their eyes wide with uncertainty. I raised the microphone back to my lips. My voice was no longer a weapon of destruction. It was an instrument of absolute truth. When my husband died, I was left with nothing but grief and a mountain of medical debt. I said the words echoing softly off the glass walls. My own parents, as you just heard, turned their backs on me. They viewed my tragedy as an inconvenience, but they were not the only family I had. I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking directly into David's weathered face. David and Karen lost their only son, I continued, and in the wake of that horrific accident they were facing their own absolute financial ruin. The medical bills and the failing economy had pushed them to the very brink. They were entirely bankrupt. They had one single asset left to their name: this very land we are standing on tonight. It was a modest, struggling equine facility, but it was theirs. It was their retirement. It was their only remaining lifeline. A soft murmur rippled through the crowd. The wealthy socialites who had just minutes ago been applauding Howard's fake generosity were now leaning forward, their expressions softening into genuine empathy. They could have sold this land, I told the crowd. They could have liquidated this property to save themselves, to pay off their debts, and secure a quiet, comfortable life. But they did not. Because when I stood in their driveway with two infant twins and nowhere to go, they did not see me as a burden. They saw me as their daughter. Karen let out a soft, muffled sob, pressing her hands over her mouth. David wrapped his thick, calloused arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. His eyes were shining with unshed tears, but he kept his gaze locked on mine. These two people were bankrupt, I declared, my voice ringing with a fierce, protective pride. But they gave me the only thing they had left in this world: this land. They signed the deed to this property over to me completely free and clear. They sacrificed their own financial survival so that my children would have a home. They are the reason this farm exists. They are the reason Vanguard Development had anything to acquire today. They are the reason my children have a life. The silence in the room shifted. It was no longer tense or horrified. It was a silence of profound, overwhelming respect. I saw a prominent city councilman subtly wipe his eye. The mayor nodded slowly, his face reflecting a deep understanding of true sacrifice. I held up the stack of legal documents, letting the bright stage lights catch the crisp white edges. Which is why yesterday I finalized a blind trust, I announced. I looked down at my in-laws, offering them a smile of pure, radiant victory. $40 million of this sale has just been permanently, irrevocably transferred to David and Karen. The sheer magnitude of the number hit the room like a physical shockwave. A collective gasp erupted from the tables. Karen let out a loud, startled cry, burying her face in David's shoulder. David's jaw dropped completely open. He stared at me, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. $40 million was a sum so vast, so entirely incomprehensible to a man who had worked the soil his entire life, that his brain simply could not process it. It is yours, I told them fiercely, leaving no room for argument or refusal. The wire transfer cleared your new private accounts an hour ago. The trust is completely shielded. You will never have to worry about a single medical bill, a mortgage payment, or a grocery receipt for the rest of your lives. You gave me a future when I had absolutely nothing. Now I am giving you yours. The crowd did not applaud this time. They stood up. It started with the mayor, who pushed his chair back and rose to his feet, offering a slow, respectful clap. The real estate developers followed suit. Then the socialites, the politicians, and the country club investors all stood up. They were offering a standing ovation, not for a business deal, but for David and Karen. for two humble bankrupt farmers who had demonstrated more grace and generosity than anyone else in the room. I watched Beverly out of the corner of my eye. She was physically vibrating with a toxic, lethal mixture of rage and jealousy. She was watching two people she had just called rural trash receive a $40 million coronation and a standing ovation from the exact high society crowd she had spent decades trying to impress. Her face was a twisted mask of pure agony. I waited for the applause to slowly die down. I was not finished. The execution required one final swing of the axe. I turned my body, pivoting away from my in-laws and facing the table where my blood relatives were sitting in stunned, horrifying silence. Howard was still clutching the edge of his table, his knuckles white, his face entirely devoid of color. Derek was staring into space, looking like a man who had just watched his own execution broadcast on live television. And Brittany was staring at me with a look of frantic, manic calculation. She was doing the math in her head. Vanguard had paid $88 million. I had just given 40 away. That left $48 million. In her twisted, entitled mind, she believed that remainder was the safety net, the portion designated for the real family. I locked eyes with my sister. I raised the microphone and delivered the final crushing blow. As for the remaining $48 million, I said, my voice dropping into a cold, ruthless cadence, that capital is locked in an impenetrable trust for my twins. Howard's head snapped up. Brittany stopped breathing. I hired the most aggressive, ruthless estate lawyers in the country to draft the terms. I continued, ensuring that every single word carried to their table. The trust is completely sealed. It cannot be contested. It cannot be borrowed against. It cannot be accessed by anyone other than my children when they reach the age of 30. There is no patriarchal reversion clause. There is no emergency family fund. There is no managing partner position. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the podium, staring directly into Howard's panicked eyes. I want to make this absolutely crystal clear to the people who thought they could march onto my property and steal my life work, I said. There is 0.0 left for anyone else. Not a single cent. The reality of those words slammed into the Wilson family like a freight train. The grand illusion was entirely dead. There was no loophole, there was no inheritance, there was no corporate buyout to save them from their own reckless, fraudulent debt. They had spent the entire evening boasting to billionaires about a fortune they would never touch. They were walking away with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and the crushing weight of their own public humiliation. Brittany stood frozen. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking like a wax mannequin. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, looking at the elegant floral centerpieces, the crystal chandeliers, and the sheer white chiffon drapery. She had paid for all of this. She had opened massive lines of credit under her own name, fully expecting to pay it off with my money tomorrow morning. She looked at her custom $15,000 silk gown. She looked at Derek, who was currently hyperventilating into a cloth napkin. The realization of her true financial situation finally breached the walls of her delusion. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Brittany's hand. It hit the polished floor with a sharp, violent shatter, sending shards of glass and expensive vintage champagne spraying across the shoes of a nearby state senator. The sound cut through the silence like a gunshot. Brittany lunged forward. She shoved past her father, scrambling toward the edge of the stage. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unhinged panic. The carefully cultivated image of the wealthy high society heiress vanished entirely, replaced by a desperate, hysterical woman staring into the abyss of absolute ruin. She grabbed the base of the microphone stand, her fingers digging into the metal. "What about us?" Brittany screamed hysterically, her voice cracking and echoing painfully through the speakers. The wealthy guests recoiled physically, stepping away from her unhinged display. "You cannot do this to us!" Brittany shrieked, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face. "Derek is $200,000 in debt. We bought a house. We put millions of dollars of renovations on credit. You have to give us our share. You owe us. You are my sister. You owe us." Brittany's voice cracked on the final syllable, echoing horribly through the silent glass atrium. Her chest heaved as she stood at the edge of the stage, gripping the microphone stand like it was a life raft. The heavy crystal droplets from the chandeliers seemed to mock her desperation, catching the light as she awaited my surrender. She genuinely expected me to fold. She expected the deeply ingrained conditioning of our childhood to kick in, forcing me to sacrifice my own security to save her from her reckless decisions. I looked at my sister. I looked at the smeared makeup under her eyes, and the frantic greed twisting her features. Then I shifted my gaze down to my parents. Beverly was clutching her throat, her eyes wide and pleading. Howard stood rigid, his jaw clamped shut, hoping sheer intimidation might somehow reverse the nightmare unfolding around him. "I owe you exactly what you gave me at Liam Grave," I said. My expression was colder than ice. My voice was flat, devoid of any anger or sorrow. It was the calm, absolute tone of a judge delivering a final, unalterable verdict. The words struck Brittany like a physical blow. She staggered backward, her hands releasing the microphone stand as if it had burned her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crisp, folded sheet of heavy bond paper. I stepped down from the podium and walked slowly to the edge of the stage. Howard glared up at me, his chest puffing out in a pathetic display of lingering defiance. I handed the itemized invoice directly to him. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before snatching it from my fingers, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the top line. "Here is the bill for the catering, the floral arrangements, the lighting, and the venue rental for tonight." "Tonight," I announced, ensuring the microphone picked up my every word. $150,000. Howard stared at the paper, his lips parting in mute horror. A fresh wave of shocked murmurs rolled through the elite crowd. $150,000 was pocket change to the billionaires in the room. But it was the principle of the demand that captivated them. They were watching a high-stakes corporate execution play out over dessert. "Payment is due immediately," I stated, folding my arms across my chest. "Or my security team will escort you off my property." Howard's face twisted into a mask of pure, indignant fury. His pride, severely wounded and bleeding out on the floor, demanded an immediate counterattack. He could not afford to look weak in front of the Vanguard executive or the country club president. He had to prove he was still the wealthy, powerful titan of industry he pretended to be. "This is an absolute outrage," Howard sputtered, attempting to summon his booming, authoritative voice. It sounded thin and reedy. "You are trying to humiliate your own father over a petty catering bill. I wipe my shoes with this kind of money. You want a check? Fine. I will write you a check right now, and then I am washing my hands of you permanently." Beverly let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. She turned toward the adjacent tables, offering a strained, apologetic smile to the staring socialites. "I is just going to pay it," Beverly announced, her voice shrill and overly loud. "We are happy to pay it. We always take care of the bills. Howard is extremely generous, as you all know." Howard plunged his hand into the inner breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He furiously reached for his leather checkbook and the same gold-plated fountain pen he had tried to use to steal my empire just minutes earlier. He slapped the checkbook down hard on the table, rattling the silverware and upsetting a water glass. He flipped it open with a flourish, ripping the cap off the gold pen. The entire room watched him. The mayor leaned forward, resting his chin on his folded hands. Ms. Sterling, the Vanguard executive, stood near the stage, her arms crossed, observing Howard with clinical, predatory interest. David and Karen watched from their prime seats, their faces entirely devoid of pity. Howard positioned the pen over the blank check. He pressed the gold nib against the paper, ready to write the sum that would theoretically save his reputation. But his hand stopped. His hand began to tremble. The slight tremor quickly escalated into a violent, uncontrolled shaking. The gold nib of the pen scratched uselessly against the paper, leaving a jagged, meaningless ink stain. Howard stared down at the checkbook, his breathing suddenly turning rapid and shallow. He knew the truth. I knew the truth. And in that terrifying, paralyzed moment, he realized that his massive, towering financial facade was finally collapsing. There was no money. Howard Wilson had leveraged every single asset he possessed to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. His primary business accounts were completely drained by terrible investments and a desperate need to keep up appearances. His personal accounts were heavily overdrawn. His pristine Boston estate carried 3 separate mortgages. His luxury vehicles were leased. Even the tuxedo he was currently wearing was likely rented or purchased on a maxed-out credit card. If he wrote a check for $150,000, it would bounce before the bank even opened on Monday morning. Writing a fraudulent check of that magnitude in front of a room full of corporate lawyers and city officials would not just be embarrassing, it would be a criminal offense. Howard swallowed hard. A thick bead of sweat rolled down his temple, tracking through the expensive cologne he wore. He gripped the pen tighter, trying to force his hand to move, but his muscles refused to obey. He was physically incapable of signing the paper. "Howard, just write the damn check," Beverly hissed, leaning over his shoulder. Her voice was meant to be a whisper, but in the dead silence of the atrium, it carried perfectly. "Just sign it and let us get out of here. People are staring." "I cannot." Howard choked out, his voice barely a rasp. "What do you mean you cannot?" Beverly demanded, her eyes widening in sudden terrifying comprehension. "Just write the numbers, Howard. Do not let her win." Derek stepped forward, his face a mask of sweaty panic. "He cannot write it, Beverly." Derek blurted out, his voice cracking. "He does not have the funds. None of us have it. My credit cards are entirely maxed out from buying Brittany dress and the flights down here. Howard took a massive loan against his company last month just to cover the interest on his secondary mortgage. We are completely broke." The admission fell upon the crowd like a heavy stone. The whispers that had been buzzing through the room instantly ceased. Absolute silence reigned. The truth was finally out in the open, ugly and undeniable. The great Wilson family, the supposed titans of Boston high society, were nothing but desperate, heavily indebted frauds. They were bankrupt parasites attempting to feast on the success of the daughter they had discarded. The country club president, a man named Richard Thorne, who was known for his ruthless banking empire, slowly stood up from his table. He walked over to where Howard was sweating over the blank checkbook. Thorne looked down at the trembling pen and the ruined ink stain on the paper. "Is this true?" Howard Thorne asked, his voice echoing with cold, aristocratic disdain. "Are you currently insolvent? Because we were scheduled to discuss a major capital investment next week. You assured me your liquidity was outstanding." Howard looked up at the banker, his eyes wide and pleading like a trapped animal. "Richard, please," Howard stammered heavily. "It is just a temporary cash flow issue, a minor liquidity tie-up. I have overseas assets clearing next quarter. I just need to transfer funds from a secondary portfolio." "Stop lying," Thorne said, cutting him off with a sharp wave of his hand. "I am a banker, Howard. I know a desperate man when I see one. You tried to steal your own daughterland to cover your massive debts. You are completely leveraged. I am pulling my firm out of all pending negotiations with your company, effective immediately." Thorne turned his back on my father and returned to his seat. The rejection was absolute. It was the final nail in the coffin of Howard's professional and social life. Beverly let out a high-pitched wail, clutching her chest. She looked around the room, seeking a single sympathetic face among the wealthy elite. She found none. The women she had played tennis with, the men she had hosted for dinner, they all looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion of her superiority was shattered, revealing the shallow, greedy reality underneath. I looked at the Vanguard security team. The 5 men in charcoal suits were already moving, forming a tight professional perimeter around my family table. "You have exactly 2 minutes to vacate this property," I announced, my voice steady and resolute. "The catering bill will be sent to your legal counsel on Monday. I expect immediate payment, or I will pursue aggressive litigation and seize whatever remaining assets you possess." Howard slowly closed his checkbook. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the leather flap to fold. He did not look at me. He did not look at David or Karen. He did not look at the mayor or the corporate executives. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, completely broken and utterly defeated. "Get up," Howard muttered to his wife and daughter, his voice dead and hollow. "We are leaving." Brittany let out another hysterical sob, covering her face as Derek grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the table. Beverly stumbled, grabbing her expensive clutch purse, her diamonds suddenly looking like cheap costume jewelry in the harsh light of reality. They walked toward the heavy glass doors of the atrium, flanked closely by the Vanguard security team. They moved like prisoners marching toward a gallows, their heads bowed, their shoulders slumped, their arrogant pride stripped away forever. The 200 wealthy guests watched them leave, maintaining an absolute stony silence as the heavy doors swung shut behind them. When the lock clicked, finalizing their expulsion from my property and my life, a sudden spontaneous cheer erupted from the center table. David had stood up, clapping his hands together with a booming, joyous laugh. Karen was wiping her eyes, smiling so hard her cheeks must have hurt. The rest of the room quickly joined in, raising their champagne glasses in a unified toast. Ms. Sterling offered me a sharp, approving smile, turning back to her briefcase to finalize the corporate transition. I stood on the stage, looking out at the glittering room, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. The ghosts were gone. The debts were exposed. The empire was secure. And the true family, the one built on sacrifice and unconditional love, had finally won. The peace inside the glass atrium was absolute, but the spectacle was not entirely over. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, the entire room could clearly see the Wilson family unraveling on the illuminated cobblestone driveway. The heavy glass doors had locked them out, but they refused to walk to their vehicles. Howard was aggressively arguing with the Vanguard security team, his face purple with exhausted rage. Beverly was actively trying to push past the charcoal-suited men, her designer clutch swinging wildly. She was sobbing hysterically, demanding to be let back inside. Inside the dining room, the high society guests were thoroughly disgusted. The unified toast had quickly transitioned into a flurry of appalled whispers. The story of Howard and Beverly cruelty spread like wildfire from table to table. Billionaires and local politicians muttered in hushed, scandalized tones about the $500 motel money and the sheer heartlessness of abandoning an infant family. The revelation of Derek crushing gambling debt and Howard hollow financial facade was the ultimate social poison. The elite crowd had seen enough. The mayor set his champagne glass down and signaled his wife. They stood up, retrieving their coats from the coat check. The rest of the room followed their lead in a synchronized wave of social rejection. The investors, the developers, and the country club executives quietly left their tables, abandoning their half-eaten desserts. They moved toward the main exit, forming a steady stream of departing wealth. As the heavy glass doors opened to let the guests out into the cool evening air, the departing elites actively shunned the Wilson family. Howard desperately tried to intercept Richard Thorne, the powerful banker, reaching out to grab his sleeve. Thorne coldly stepped out of the way, brushing his jacket off, as if Howard carried a contagious disease. He did not even break his stride, simply walking to his waiting town car without a single backward glance. The other socialites pulled their fur coats tighter around their shoulders, keeping their eyes fixed straight ahead, entirely ignoring Beverly's pathetic wailing. The social standing my parents valued above absolutely everything else was instantly and permanently incinerated. They were dead to Boston high society. I watched the exodus from the stage. David and Karen stood beside me, their expressions a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The Vanguard executive, Ms. Sterling, offered a respectful nod as she packed her briefcase, gesturing that her security team would handle the final removal. But I needed to see it through. I needed to witness their departure to ensure the severing was absolute. "Let us go outside," I said quietly, turning to my in-laws. "We need to make sure they actually leave." We walked through the center of the atrium, passing the empty tables and the abandoned crystal glasses. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped through the front doors onto the expansive cobblestone driveway. The moment my heels clicked against the stone, Beverly spotted me. Her eyes went wide and manic. She broke away from the security guard who was attempting to herd her toward her least luxury sedan. "Abigail!" Beverly shrieked, her voice raw and jagged. She stumbled forward, her high heels catching on the uneven stones. She looked nothing like the polished matriarch who had entered the venue hours earlier. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks and her expensive silk wrap was sliding off her shoulder. "Abigail, please, you cannot do this to us!" Beverly cried out, dropping all pretense of dignity. She threw her hands out in a desperate begging gesture. "We are your family. We are your blood. You cannot leave us with nothing. We will lose the house in Boston. We will lose everything. You have $88 million. You have more money than you could ever spend. Just give us a fraction. Just pay off the debts. Please, Abigail, I am your mother. She lunged forward, as if to grab my arms, intending to force me into an embrace of manufactured maternal desperation. I did not move. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigidly upright, refusing to yield a single inch of ground. Howard, seeing Beverly begging, abandoned his fruitless attempts to sway the departing politicians. He marched toward me, his chest heaving, his tuxedo jacket completely unbuttoned. The arrogant bluster was entirely gone, replaced by a pathetic, hollow desperation. "Listen to reason," Abigail Howard commanded, though his voice shook uncontrollably. "You proved your point. You won the negotiation. You embarrassed us in front of the mayor. Fine. But business is business. You cannot let your own father declare bankruptcy. It will ruin the family name. The press will destroy us. Write the check. We can structure it as an investment in my firm. You will get equity." I was still trying to negotiate. Even facing absolute ruin, he could only communicate in the language of transactions and leverage. He genuinely believed that a thick enough pile of cash could purchase absolution. Behind him, Derek was physically weeping. He had collapsed against the bumper of their car, his head buried in his hands, shaking with the terrifying realization that his mountain of gambling debt had finally caught up with him. He was a broken man, anticipating the violent consequences of his hidden life. Brittany stood near the passenger door, shivering in the night air. She gripped the fabric of her $15,000 dress, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes. The manic hysteria had burned itself out, leaving only the cold ash of reality. She was going to lose her house. She was going to lose her country club membership. She was going to have to return the designer clothes and face the brutal, unforgiving judgment of her peers. She opened her mouth to speak, to hurl another venomous insult or beg for a lifeline, but no words came out. She was entirely defeated. Beverly took another stumbling step forward, her hands reaching out to grab the fabric of my dress. "Please," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "Just $1 million, just $500,000. You owe us for raising you." Before her grasping fingers could even graze my clothing, David and Karen moved. They did not hesitate, they moved with the synchronized protective instinct of true parents. David, broad shoulders squared as he stepped firmly in front of me, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between my body and my father. He planted his heavy boots on the cobblestones, crossing his muscular arms over his chest. He did not say a word, but the hard, unyielding look in his eyes communicated a lethal warning. Howard stopped dead in his tracks, shrinking away from the sheer physical presence of a man who spent his life working the earth. Karen stepped up right beside her husband, positioning herself directly in front of Beverly. Karen was shorter than my mother, and she wore a simple, off-the-rack dress that Beverly had mocked endlessly all evening. But in that moment, Karen radiated a towering, terrifying authority. She looked at Beverly's smeared makeup and desperate, grasping hands with absolute, profound disgust. "You told us to sit with the hired help," Karen said, her voice soft but carrying the sharp, lethal edge of a drawn blade. Beverly froze, her mouth hanging open. She stared at Karen, the woman she had dismissed as rural trash, suddenly realizing that this woman wielded more power and possessed more dignity than Beverly could ever hope to attain. "You walked into this property and you insulted my family," Karen continued, her eyes locking onto Beverly with laser precision. "You mocked our home. You treated my husband like dirt. You paraded around this estate trying to steal the very ground my son is buried on. You abandoned Abigail when she was starving and broken. You left your own grandsons to sleep in a motel." Beverly tried to speak, her hands shaking wildly. I did not know how hard it was going to be." "You knew exactly what you were doing," Karen stated, cutting off the pathetic excuse entirely. "You are a cold, cruel woman, Beverly, and you are standing on soil that belongs to me and my husband. We own $40 million of this estate now, and we do not tolerate trespassers." Karen took one slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Beverly to stumble backward in her high heels to avoid a collision. "Now get off our daughter property," Karen commanded. The word daughter echoed in the night air, ringing with absolute, undeniable truth. Karen had claimed me. She had claimed the role that Beverly had so callously discarded. I felt a surge of overwhelming love and gratitude wash through my chest, warming the cold places my biological parents had left behind. The Vanguard security team recognized the finality of the confrontation. The charcoal-suited men moved in with ruthless, synchronized efficiency. They formed a tight half-circle around the Wilson family, physically cutting off any further approach toward the atrium. "It is time to leave, Ms. Sterling," lead security officer stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Get in your vehicles." Howard looked at the massive security guards. He looked at David's unyielding stance. He looked at the departing taillights of the high society guests who had abandoned them. His shoulders slumped completely. The fight drained entirely out of his body. He was an empty, hollow shell of a man. He turned without a word and shuffled toward the driver's side of their leased sedan, moving like an old, exhausted ghost. Beverly let out one final piercing wail, a sound of pure, devastated agony. She looked at me over Karen's shoulder, her eyes silently begging for a reprieve that would never come. I did not blink. I did not offer a shred of sympathy. I stood behind the protective wall of my true family and watched her world end. The security guards gently but firmly grabbed Beverly by the elbows, guiding her away from the building. She thrashed weakly against their grip, but she had no strength left. They deposited her into the passenger seat of the sedan, shutting the heavy door with a solid metallic thud. Derek and Brittany had already retreated to their own vehicle. Derek was in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared blankly through the windshield, terrified of the debt collectors waiting for him back in Boston. Brittany sat beside him, her face turned away, staring out into the dark night. The engines roared to life, disrupting the quiet country air. Howard put the car in gear. The tires crunched against the imported cobblestones. The two vehicles rolled slowly forward, navigating the circular driveway toward the heavy iron security gates at the front of the estate. I stood on the front steps, the cool night breeze lifting my hair. David rested his heavy, warm hand on my shoulder, giving it a gentle, reassuring squeeze. Karen slipped her arm around my waist, resting her head against my side. We stood together, a united, unbreakable front. I watched the twin sets of red taillights drift down the long, winding driveway. I watched them pass the manicured paddocks and the state-of-the-art breeding facilities that I had built from nothing. I watched them reach the main gate, pausing for a brief second before pulling out onto the dark, empty highway. The red lights grew smaller and smaller, fading into the distance until they disappeared, completely swallowed entirely by the deep blackness of the night. I closed my eyes and took a long, slow, deep breath. The air tasted clean and pure. The suffocating pressure in my chest, the decades of anxiety, the desperate need for validation, and the constant looming threat of their judgment evaporated into nothingness. I exhaled, releasing every last ounce of the pain they had caused. The toxic weight of my past was finally permanently severed forever. It has been exactly 365 days since I watched those twin sets of red taillights vanish into the dark. One entire year since I purged the poison from my life and claimed the future my children truly deserved. The morning air in Massachusetts carried the crisp, clean scent of blooming lilac and fresh pine. I stood on the wrap-around porch of my new home, gripping a warm mug of coffee. The sprawling property stretched out before me, a breathtaking expanse of emerald green pastures, enclosed by miles of pristine white fencing. We had not just salvaged the modest, struggling farm, we had utterly transformed it. Thanks to the Vanguard acquisition and the carefully structured trusts, we had built a world-class boutique equine breeding facility from the ground up. State-of-the-art climate-controlled barns sat perfectly integrated into the rolling landscape. The best veterinary equipment, the finest feed, and the most experienced stable hands were all operating under our unified banner. It was a paradise forged from the ashes of a nightmare. I looked across the paved courtyard toward the secondary residence on the estate. It was a stunning, custom-built luxury farmhouse designed entirely around David and Karen. They had flatly refused my initial offer to buy them a mansion on a tropical island. They told me their paradise was right here with their grandchildren and their horses. But their lives were entirely different now. I watched Karen step out onto her patio wearing a beautifully tailored linen dress that flowed perfectly in the morning breeze. She was laughing, holding a tray of freshly sliced fruit. David followed close behind her. The deep, exhausting lines of stress and financial terror that used to age his face had completely vanished. He looked 10 years younger. He wore premium leather boots and a high-end flannel shirt, but he still carried his favorite worn-out work gloves. They no longer worked the soil out of a desperate need to survive. They worked because they loved the land. They were finally enjoying a luxurious, completely stress-free retirement, surrounded by the family they had actively chosen to protect. My 5-year-old twins came sprinting out of Karen's kitchen, their joyful shrieks echoing across the courtyard. David dropped to one knee, catching them both in his massive arms, spinning them around until their laughter filled the entire estate. I smiled, taking a slow sip of my coffee. My chest was light. The chronic suffocating anxiety that had dictated my every move for over 3 decades was entirely gone. Later that morning, I grabbed my keys and drove my reliable, sturdy truck into town. The local cafe was a quiet, upscale spot with exposed brick walls and the rich aroma of roasted espresso. I was meeting an old associate, an elite equine investor named Marcus, who had helped me broker some of my very first independent sales when I was still struggling to build my name. Marcus was already sitting at a corner table nursing a black coffee. When I walked in, he stood up, offering a warm, respectful smile. He pulled out my chair and we settled into an easy, comfortable conversation about bloodlines, auction prices, and the phenomenal success of our new breeding program. But as the conversation shifted away from business, Marcus leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He moved in the same wealthy Boston circles that my biological parents had once dominated. He possessed the kind of quiet wealth that saw everything and forgot nothing. "I suppose you heard about Howard and Beverly," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a discreet conversational volume. I shook my head, taking a calm, deliberate sip of my latte. I had not heard a single word. On the Monday following the Vanguard Gala, I had changed my phone number. I blocked every email address associated with my blood relatives. I instructed my legal counsel to issue cease and desist orders, preventing them from ever stepping foot within a 10-mile radius of my property. I had effectively severed their existence from my reality. "I have not heard a thing," I replied, my tone completely neutral. "And frankly, I prefer it that way." Marcus offered a knowing, sympathetic nod. "I understand entirely. But the magnitude of their collapse was so spectacular, it practically shook the foundation of the financial district. It is a cautionary tale being whispered at every country club from here to Manhattan." He could not help himself. The gossip was simply too massive to withhold. Marcus proceeded to lay out the explosive, catastrophic ruin of the Wilson Empire. When Richard Thorne, the powerful banking executive, pulled his firm backing on the night of the gala, it triggered an immediate, lethal domino effect. The rumor of Howard's sudden insolvency spread through the elite networking circles before sunrise. By Monday morning, Howard creditors were in a state of absolute panic. The banks called in their commercial loans. The 3 heavily leveraged mortgages on their Beacon Hill estate were suddenly and aggressively due. The illusion of their towering wealth disintegrated instantly. But the final fatal blow came from Derek. The terrifying extent of Derek's gambling debts surfaced violently. Vicious loan sharks and aggressive collection agencies began harassing the family, threatening to seize assets and initiate criminal proceedings. To save their precious son-in-law from facing prison time, and to prevent Brittany from declaring a highly publicized individual bankruptcy, Howard and Beverly were forced to liquidate absolutely everything they owned. They sold the Grand Beacon Hill mansion at a massive, devastating loss, simply to generate immediate cash. They were forced to auction off Beverly's entire collection of diamonds, her antique imported furniture, and their fleet of leased luxury cars. The country club, the absolute center of their social universe, formally and publicly revoked their membership, citing unpaid dues and the sheer unbearable scandal of their insolvency. "They lost everything," Marcus said, shaking his head in mild disbelief. "And society is a vicious machine, Abigail. The very people who drank their champagne and attended their lavish dinner parties turned their backs instantly. The elites actively shunned them. When Beverly tried to attend a charity luncheon, she was quietly asked to leave by the organizers. They incinerated their social standing overnight. Where are they now? I asked. The question was driven by mild curiosity rather than any lingering emotional attachment. They rent a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a dreary industrial suburb, Marcus replied. Howard is working as a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, taking orders from executives half his age just to keep the lights on. Beverly refuses to leave the apartment out of sheer humiliation. And Brittany and Derek are trapped in a miserable, toxic marriage, drowning in resentment and fighting constantly over the pennies they have left. Brittany was forced to sell her custom designer gowns to consignment shops just to afford groceries. Marcus sat back, studying my face closely. He was likely expecting me to smile, to gloat, or to revel in the vindictive triumph of their destruction. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no surge of manic joy. There was no lingering sorrow. I simply looked at my coffee cup, processing the information with the detached clinical interest of someone reading a news article about strangers. They had built a fragile, towering prison, constructed entirely of greed, lies, and an insatiable need for social dominance. When the foundation cracked, the collapse was inevitable. Karma had executed its verdict flawlessly, without requiring me to lift a single finger. I appreciate you telling me, Marcus, I said, placing my coffee cup back on its saucer. But their lives are their own. They chose their path, and now they are walking it. My focus is entirely on the future. Marcus smiled, raising his coffee cup in a silent toast of profound respect. You are a remarkable woman, Abigail. You survived a hurricane and built an empire from the wreckage. We wrapped up our meeting, finalizing the details of a lucrative upcoming horse auction. I walked out of the cafe into the bright afternoon sun, pulling my sunglasses down over my eyes. I climbed into my truck and drove the familiar winding roads back to my estate. As I approached the heavy wrought iron security gates, they swung open automatically, welcoming me back into my sanctuary. I drove slowly up the long paved driveway, rolling my windows down to let the sweet smell of the pasture fill the cabin. In the distance, several of our champion thoroughbreds were grazing peacefully, their sleek coats shining like polished mahogany in the sunlight. I parked near the main farmhouse and stepped out. The scene before me was a living, breathing masterpiece of peace and security. David was standing near the pristine white fence of the primary paddock, holding a lead rope and gently brushing the mane of a young, beautiful foal. Karen was sitting on the porch swing, a woven basket of fresh vegetables from her garden resting at her feet. She was watching the twins, who were currently rolling down a grassy hill, their joyous, uninhibited laughter echoing across the entire property. They were safe. They were endlessly loved. They would never experience the cold, conditional affection that had poisoned my childhood. They would never be told they were a burden. They would only ever know the steadfast, fiercely protective devotion of the two people who had sacrificed everything to keep them safe. I walked across the lawn, the soft green grass cushioning my steps. Karen looked up and offered a bright, welcoming smile, patting the empty space on the porch swing beside her. David turned and waved, his weathered face crinkling with genuine happiness. I stood at the edge of the pasture, resting my hands on the smooth wooden fence rail. I looked out over the sprawling, magnificent estate we had built together. I watched my children run freely under the vast, limitless blue sky. I realized in that quiet, perfect moment the ultimate profound truth of my existence. True wealth was not the $48 million sitting in an impenetrable, heavily guarded trust fund for my twins. It was not the $40 million that had permanently secured David and Karen golden years. It was not the elite breeding facility, or the sprawling acreage, or the lucrative corporate contracts. True wealth was the absolute, unapologetic freedom to walk away from those who do not know your worth. It was the power to draw a hard, permanent line in the sand and refuse to be victimized by toxic expectations. It was the beautiful, hard-won ability to protect the chosen family who shielded you from the storm when you had absolutely nothing left to offer them but your heart. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean, sweet air of my own personal paradise. I was finally, completely and irrevocably home. 1 year later, the air on my estate feels even sweeter. David and Karen are currently watching my twins chase butterflies across the lush green pastures of our new world-class boutique breeding facility. They are finally enjoying the luxurious, stress-free retirement they always deserved. Earlier this morning, I met a former client for coffee in the city. Between sips of espresso, she casually mentioned the spectacular downfall of the Wilson family. Howard and Beverly were forced to sell their heavily mortgaged estate just to cover Brittany and Derek crushing bankruptcy. In the process, they lost their precious country club memberships and every single high society friend they ever claimed to have. They traded their daughter for status and ended up with absolutely nothing. Looking out over my new pasture as my twins laugh and play in the warm sun, I realize the ultimate truth about what it means to be rich. True wealth is not the millions sitting in my bank accounts or the elite contracts keeping this farm running. True wealth is the absolute freedom to walk away from those who refuse to see your worth. It is the unyielding power to protect the chosen family who shielded you from the storm when you had nothing to offer them but your presence. We are taught to bleed ourselves dry for the sake of blood relations, but loyalty should never be a one-way street paved with abuse. You have the right to sever the ties that bind you to toxic expectations. Share your experiences in the comments below. Let me know how you found the strength to choose your own peace over toxic family demands. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about claiming your worth and building a life on your own terms. Remember, your peace is your most valuable asset, and you are always allowed to protect it.